Picture the world 30,000 years ago. No cities, no roads, no warm cafes to hide in when the weather gets nasty. Just you, your fellow humans, and a climate that decided to take winter and crank it up to apocalypse mode. This was the late Pleistocene, the grand finale of the last ice age, when glaciers didn't just sit politely in the Arctic, they wandered down over continents like uninvited relatives who overstay their welcome. These weren't little frosty patches either. Vast ice sheets, sometimes 2 miles thick, crept across what is now North America, Europe, and Asia. Mountains wore white crowns all year round. Valleys were buried under layers of ice so heavy they crushed the earth beneath. You couldn't step outside without feeling like you'd walked into nature's version of a walk-in freezer, except the door was broken and no one knew how to fix it. And the air? Cold, yes, but also dry. Weirdly enough, a lot of the planet's water was locked up in ice, so deserts existed alongside frozen tundra. The wind would slice through your fur clothing like it had a personal vendetta, carrying fine ice crystals that somehow managed to get into everything: your clothes, your bedding, even your eyebrows. The good news? No mosquitoes. The bad news? The wolves are bigger than your cousin Gary. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, how humans may have befriended wolves during the Ice Age, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Daily life was an exhausting battle to not die of hypothermia, starvation, or, being eaten. The human population was tiny compared to today, scattered in small bands across landscapes that looked more like alien planets than the lush forests and farmland we're used to. Forests were rare, mostly replaced by steppe tundra, endless open grasslands dotted with shrubs, and the occasional tree clinging to life like it owed the Ice Age money. Food didn't come from supermarkets. It came from hunting and gathering, which meant constant movement. Our ancestors were nomads, following herds of mammoth, bison, and reindeer across hundreds of miles. Imagine hauling your entire life with you: tools, food stores, and your less-than-athletic cousin who couldn't run from a saber-toothed cat if his life depended on it, and often it did. Camps were temporary, built from whatever was available: animal hides, bones, driftwood, or ice itself. If you were lucky, you had a fire going. If you weren't, you shivered through the night wondering if tomorrow's dinner might instead be tomorrow's predator. And predators? Oh, there were predators. Wolves, of course, roamed the land, though they were bigger, stronger, and far less interested in playing fetch than their modern descendants. Saber-toothed cats stalked the grasslands. Cave lions, yes, actual lions, just bulkier and meaner, lurked near the edges of forests. Even the herbivores could be dangerous. Step on the wrong woolly rhinoceros and you'd find out just how fast you could run in fur boots. The human advantage was intelligence, and intelligence had to be exercised daily just to make it to the next sunrise. That meant making clothes from the hides of what you hunted, inventing better tools from stone, bone, and antler, and finding ways to store meat before it spoiled, which, given the climate, was less about refrigeration and more about making sure other hungry mouths didn't take it first. There was no chill day in the Ice Age. There were only try not to freeze days and try not to starve days, and often both at once. Social life revolved around survival. You hunted together, ate together, and slept together. Not in a cozy romantic sense, but in the very literal share body heat or die sense. At night, the darkness was total, pierced only by firelight and the occasional howl in the distance, which might mean wolves, or might mean something worse. And if you think your neighbor's dog barking at 3 a.m. is annoying, imagine a giant wolf shadow pacing just beyond the glow of your fire. For thousands of years this was normal. Children grew up knowing nothing but snow and cold. Adults carried the mental map of a landscape constantly changing as glaciers advanced or retreated. Seasons existed, technically, but summer might just mean slightly fewer layers and not needing to thaw your water before drinking it. In this world, every advantage counted. Every tool, every bit of knowledge, every sliver of luck. And somewhere in that frozen expanse, humans began to notice a curious thing. Not all wolves kept their distance. Some lingered, watching, not as predators ready to strike, but as something else, something new. Before they became social media-friendly fluffballs in sweaters, wolves were something entirely different, especially in the Ice Age. These weren't the sleek, mid-sized predators you might see in a nature documentary today. These were Ice Age wolves, bigger, bulkier, and built like the linebackers of the animal kingdom. Think of your average grey wolf, then add a few extra inches to the shoulders, a heavier skull, and jaws designed not just for taking down deer, but for cracking through the bones of mammoths if given the chance. Scientifically speaking, the Pleistocene wolf Canis lupus was adapted for a much harsher, more competitive world. Prey was often massive, armored in thick hides and muscle, and capable of killing you if you miscalculated your attack. That meant wolves had to be powerful, fast, and extremely coordinated. Their teeth were larger and more robust than modern wolves, and their bite could crush through bone like it was stale bread. Modern wolves have a bite force of about 400 pounds per square inch. Ice Age wolves, probably even more, though no one's been reckless enough to measure it firsthand. And it wasn't just size. Ice Age wolves were endurance athletes. They could chase prey for miles across open tundra, conserving energy until the moment they lunged. In a world where every hunt could mean the difference between life and starvation, wolves evolved to be relentless. If you were prey, you could run, but unless you had the stamina of an Olympic marathoner and the agility of a parkour expert, your odds weren't great. Now, from a human's perspective, this made wolves problematic. You see, humans and wolves didn't just share the same planet, they shared the same menu. Both hunted herbivores like deer, bison and elk. Both needed a lot of calories to keep warm in the frigid climate, and both were clever enough to know the other was competition. Every mammoth a wolf pack brought down was one fewer meal for a human hunting band, and vice versa. But here's where the wolf problem got extra complicated. Wolves were fast. Humans, at the time, were not exactly known for their sprinting abilities. We could throw a spear pretty well and think up clever traps, but in a straight chase across snowy plains we were about as threatening as a meat popsicle. Wolves could reach speeds of up to 40 miles per hour when closing in on prey. That meant they often arrived first, or worse, arrived right after you had finally brought something down, ready to take your hard-earned dinner. Picture it. You and your small hunting party have just spent hours tracking a reindeer, creeping into range, throwing your spears, and finally bringing it down. You're congratulating each other, already imagining the meat roasting over the fire. And then, from the tree line, a pack of wolves emerges, moving with that casual, spine-chilling confidence that says, "Thanks for doing all the hard work, we'll take it from here." Imagine trying to hunt a deer while a pack of wolves stares at you like you're the appetizer. And these weren't solo operators. Ice Age wolves hunted in packs that could range from 6 to 20 animals depending on the prey and the territory. Each member of the pack had a role, from chasing down the target to cutting off escape routes. The teamwork was so precise it could make human hunting parties look disorganized by comparison. For humans, fighting off a single wolf was doable. Fighting off 10, that was suicide. Wolves also had a territorial streak. Their ranges could span hundreds of square miles, and they defended them with tooth and claw. If humans wandered into an area a pack considered theirs, they might not just ignore you, they could actively harass you, shadowing your movements and waiting for you to slip up. It was like living next door to a gang of armed neighbors who had no respect for property lines. And yet, despite their menace, there was something about wolves that demanded respect. They were survivors, just like humans. They thrived in conditions that killed less adaptable animals. They worked together, cared for their young, and even shared food with injured or elderly pack members. In that way they mirrored human social structures, which perhaps made the competition sting even more. It's one thing to be beaten to dinner by a mindless predator. It's another to lose to an opponent who seems to be using the same playbook you are. For humans of the Ice Age, the wolf problem was twofold. They were dangerous in their own right, and they were taking food out of your mouth. Any encounter could turn deadly, not just because of teeth and claws, but because losing a single hunt could mean days without a meal. That reality bred caution. You didn't just watch the horizon for mammoth herds. You watched for moving shadows that signaled a pack on the prowl. It would take thousands of years before humans began to see these predators in a different light. Not as competition, but as potential allies. But here, in the thick of the Ice Age, that transformation was still a distant possibility. For now, wolves were a problem, and one you couldn't ignore. At first glance, the idea of humans befriending wolves during the Ice Age sounds like a plot twist from a particularly cruel nature documentary. Why on earth would anyone approach a predator whose teeth could crush bone and whose hunting skills made Olympic sprinters look like toddlers? The short answer: survival. And survival, in the Ice Age, was rarely about comfort. It was about not becoming someone else's dinner. Humans, though clever, were small, slow, and poorly defended. Fur clothing offered warmth, but it didn't stop a predator from sinking teeth into your shoulder if you wandered too far from camp. A spear could kill a wolf, eventually, but not without risk. And let's be honest, even the most skilled hunter wasn't exactly a ninja. Wolves were everywhere, and they weren't just a nuisance, they were a serious threat. But here's where humans began to think differently. Maybe these terrifying creatures could be helpful. The logic is simple. If a wolf is dangerous alone, maybe it's less dangerous if it sees you as part of its own pack. Ice Age humans needed three things more than anything else: protection, help tracking prey, and sometimes warmth during nights that could make modern freezers blush. Wolves offered all three if approached cautiously. Protection first. Wolves are naturally alert, always listening for the snap of a twig or the crunch of snow underfoot. That same instinct could be a human's advantage. A wolf lingering near camp could detect danger long before the humans did, whether it was a rival predator or a wandering herd of mammoths. It was like having a living, breathing alarm system, one that snarled if the intruder came too close. Imagine waking up at night, half frozen, and hearing growls outside the camp. You don't panic. You know that whatever made that sound is more interested in keeping its own belly full than in fighting you. Probably. Tracking help was another benefit. Wolves had a sixth sense for prey. They could follow scents over miles, interpret subtle signs in the environment, and anticipate movements of animals humans would never detect. If a pack of wolves trailed a herd, humans could follow from a safe distance, letting the wolves do most of the tracking work. Essentially, humans began outsourcing part of their hunting strategy. Because in the Ice Age, outsourcing could be the difference between feasting and fasting. And warmth. Don't underestimate the power of a warm, furry body on a night where frostbite could claim your toes before breakfast. Early humans likely noticed that wolves' bodies radiated heat, that huddling near them reduced shivering, and that having another living creature nearby provided a psychological boost. But if nothing else, a wolf's presence made the dark nights slightly less lonely and slightly less terrifying. Of course, this was a delicate dance. Humans couldn't simply invite wolves into the camp and hope for the best. It started with observation, recognizing which wolves were bold but not aggressive, which ones were curious but not predatory. Over time, humans may have learned to leave scraps at the edge of camp, demonstrating we won't hurt you. And also, here's dinner. Wolves got used to humans as sources of food rather than threats, and humans learned that some wolves could be trusted enough to linger near them without immediately attacking. This relationship was inherently mutualistic, even in its earliest form. Humans provided food scraps, protection from rivals, and occasionally shelter. Wolves provided early warning signals, companionship, and hunting assistance. It was a precarious balance, one that required careful reading of behavior, patience, and probably a fair amount of trial and error and occasional loss of fingers. Imagine it like the original home security system, but with bonuses. It barks, it growls, it might even steal your dinner if you're careless, yet it saves you from being eaten by something worse. Over time, humans began to recognize patterns in wolf behavior. noting which members of a pack were dominant, which were submissive, and which ones could be befriended safely. Social intelligence became key. A wolf pack is a complex social structure, and humans had to understand it to coexist. By slowly integrating wolves into their routines, letting them linger near camps, observing hunting patterns, sharing food, humans were effectively conducting Ice Age behavioral experiments. They didn't have labs or grant funding. Their results were measured in calories, survival rates, and nights spent not frozen to death. Every wolf that tolerated human presence without attacking was a potential ally. Every human who learned to respect wolf social cues avoided becoming dinner. This cautious approach laid the foundation for something extraordinary, a relationship that went beyond fear and competition, moving into cooperation and eventually companionship. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It required observation, intelligence, and most importantly, the willingness to take a risk. A wolf could kill you. A wolf could save you. Humans decided in their frozen, desperate world that the gamble was worth it. In short, befriending a predator wasn't reckless. It was survival strategy. It was innovative, risky, and genius. The kind of decision that defined who would thrive in the Ice Age and who would vanish into history. And yes, it also set the stage for one of humanity's most enduring friendships. One built not on cuddles or Instagram likes, but on mutual survival and a shared understanding. The cold is harsh, the world is dangerous, and together maybe we stand a chance. The first step toward the legendary human-dog alliance probably didn't involve grand ceremonies, treaties, or heartwarming eye contact. It started with something much simpler: leftovers. Humans hunted, killed, and butchered their prey, often leaving scraps behind, either because they were inedible, too tough, or simply not worth the effort. Enter the wolves, opportunistic, intelligent, and hungry. Imagine a group of humans gathered around a recently felled reindeer or bison, chopping it into edible portions. A few steps back in the shadows, a pair of wolves watches. Their noses twitch. Their eyes, glinting in the low sunlight, track every movement. Hunger gnaws at them. Yes, but so does curiosity. Unlike other predators, they don't immediately rush in for the kill. They wait, they assess, they learn the human's patterns. Over days, weeks, months, wolves begin to realize a startling truth. Humans are generous in their own way. A pile of bones, scraps, or partially eaten meals might just appear on the outskirts of camp. And humans, for their part, begin noticing a pattern too. Some wolves are cautious, hanging back, sniffing the air, not attacking the meat or the people. They linger at a distance, their eyes reflecting intelligence rather than raw aggression. Early humans start to recognize that not every wolf is a death sentence on four legs. Some are curious. Some seem almost manageable. It's important to emphasize the delicacy of these interactions. Unlike a modern backyard dog, Ice Age wolves were not domesticated. They were still wild, formidable, and unpredictable. A wrong move, a sudden gesture, a poorly timed noise, or an uninvited approach could result in death. So humans proceeded cautiously, experimenting with the idea that some wolves could be tolerated rather than immediately driven off. Perhaps they left scraps further away from the fire, or offered pieces of meat to test reactions. Each interaction was a high-stakes behavioral experiment. Interestingly, this period may have involved a kind of mutual surveillance. Wolves watched humans, learning their hunting habits, movement patterns, and even the best times to approach the camp. Humans watched wolves, cataloging behavior, noting which ones tolerated proximity and which remained aggressively distant. Over time, a delicate understanding formed. Certain wolves, maybe the bold, intelligent ones, came closer to camp, observing but not attacking. Humans, in turn, learned to tolerate their presence, realizing the wolves were more useful as allies than as threats. This slow, cautious dance created what we might call the world's first awkward friendship. Think of it as the prehistoric equivalent of meeting a neighbor at a fence and agreeing, "You don't eat me, I don't eat you" deal. It was tentative, filled with pauses, missteps, and probably a fair amount of mutual confusion. But the benefits were becoming apparent. A wolf lingering near the camp could alert humans to dangers that they couldn't see, predators, rival bands, or even approaching weather changes. This first contact phase also likely included following behavior. Wolves, naturally curious and always hungry, may have started trailing human hunting parties at a safe distance. A human group chasing a herd of reindeer would unknowingly lead a wolf pack through familiar territory. Wolves could watch how humans cornered prey, learned their signaling methods, and scavenged what was left behind. Humans benefited too, by observing the wolves' tracking techniques and noticing where they sniffed or pointed with their noses. Early humans gained new insights into animal behavior, migration routes, and hunting strategies. The relationship was still tentative, but the groundwork for cooperation was laid. Wolves weren't invited inside the tents or welcomed by name, and humans didn't yet treat them as companions in the modern sense. But the seeds were sown. Both species had to navigate boundaries, humans testing the wolves' tolerance, wolves assessing humans' reactions. Each party learned limits and behaviors. Over time, the most adaptable wolves, the bold, intelligent, and social ones, began to integrate more closely with human activity. This phase of early wolf-human interaction also highlights something often overlooked: the role of curiosity. Ice Age humans were curious too. They didn't just see wolves as competitors. They observed, analyzed, and tested the possibilities of collaboration. And wolves, for all their predatory instincts, showed a surprising willingness to explore human proximity without immediate aggression. It was the beginning of a behavioral feedback loop that would thousands of years later lead to the domesticated dogs we know today. In short, the first encounters were delicate, experimental, and full of risk. They were about survival, observation, and a cautious curiosity that required both patience and intelligence. The Ice Age landscape was harsh, resources were scarce, and one wrong move could be fatal. Yet, through this high-stakes, awkward interaction, humans and wolves began to recognize a shared advantage. Humans provided food and predictable routines. Wolves provided protection, insight, and assistance. And somewhere between cautious observation and careful testing, the Ice Age birthed the first truce, a fragile understanding that despite all appearances, predator and prey could coexist. Think of it as the world's first awkward friendship. You don't eat me, I don't eat you. Deal. It was not the beginning of cuddles and belly rubs, but it was the critical first step toward one of history's most remarkable partnerships. Once humans and wolves had navigated the awkward first encounters, something remarkable began to happen. Wolves that had previously lurked at the edges of campfires or trailed from a safe distance started lingering closer. Not every wolf, of course, only the bolder, more adaptable individuals, but enough to spark a subtle transformation in the relationship. Humans were beginning to understand that not all wolves were out to eat them. Some could be trusted, cautiously and conditionally, and for those wolves the world suddenly offered a buffet without the stress of chasing prey across frozen tundra. This was the phase where mere curiosity evolved into cooperation. Wolves started recognizing patterns. Humans were consistent, predictable, and crucially capable of providing regular food sources in the form of scraps, discarded bones, or unfinished meals. Over time, the wolves most inclined to tolerate human proximity, those less fearful and more socially adept, gained a serious advantage. They were rewarded for being friendlier, even if friendly in this context meant hang around without biting anyone. Bomplisics wasn't conscious on the humans' part at first. It was more trial and error. They learned which wolves could be left alone, which ones could be tolerated near the fire, and which were outright trouble. From a biological perspective, this dynamic laid the foundation for selective tolerance. Humans inadvertently encouraged certain traits in wolves: boldness, curiosity, sociability, simply by tolerating their presence. Wolves that were aggressive, skittish, or overly predatory tended not to survive near human camps. Those that could manage their instincts, who could coexist peacefully, were fed, indirectly protected, and given a front-row seat to the abundance humans created. Over generations, this subtle selection pressure shifted wolf behavior. The species that lingered around humans were increasingly the ones capable of forming bonds, however tenuous. Meanwhile, humans were changing too. The constant presence of wolves demanded new social skills: observation, patience, and understanding of body language. Humans began reading tail positions, ear movements, and postures. This wasn't just survival, it was early cross-species diplomacy. A stiff wag of the tail, or a lowered head, could mean the difference between a shared meal and a chewed-up arm. In essence, humans were teaching wolves, without realizing it, how to behave in a camp environment. And wolves were learning fast. The evolutionary consequences were profound. Wolves who tolerated human proximity were more likely to receive food and protection, giving them a reproductive advantage. Over thousands of years, this pressure nudged populations toward what we might call proto-dogs, animals less fearful of humans, more cooperative, and socially tuned to their behavior. At the same time, humans were developing a taste for these new allies. They weren't just survival tools, they were companions with predictable patterns, enhancing hunting efficiency and camp security. Humorously, one can imagine the first wolves figuring this out. Thought the bold wolf crouched by the fire. If I keep my teeth to myself and sit nicely, the humans toss me a tasty scrap, and if I bark at something scary, they act impressed. This smiling without biting trick really works. I think I'll keep doing it. In other words, some wolves essentially discovered the original treat-for-trick deal, millennia before dog biscuits were invented. It's also important to note that this phase of evolution was slow, subtle, and entirely natural. There was no conscious domestication at this point. Humans were merely tolerating some wolves and ignoring others. Wolves were merely adapting to the opportunities and pressures presented by human camps. But the combination of selective tolerance and natural selection produced a remarkable outcome: a population of wolves that was increasingly inclined to work with humans rather than against them. Interestingly, this period also gave rise to early social learning in wolves. The young wolves observed their elders interacting with humans and copied their behavior. Bold, friendly wolves survived. Shy, aggressive wolves often did not. By watching which individuals received food and which were chased away, wolf pups learned the unspoken rules of human interaction. In short, culture was evolving in two species simultaneously: humans learning to tolerate and predict wolf behavior, wolves learning to navigate human behavior for survival. By the end of this stage, the bond had solidified enough that wolves were no longer just curious visitors, they were trusted companions, if conditionally so. They helped humans by signaling danger, keeping other predators at bay, and occasionally assisting in hunts. They helped themselves by gaining access to consistent food, warmth, and protection. It was a mutually beneficial relationship rooted in observation, trial and error, and the subtle hand of natural selection. Ultimately, this evolution of the wolf-human bond set the stage for the next chapter in history: active cooperation. From lingering near fires and following hunting parties, wolves would eventually become partners in hunting and daily survival, the precursors of the dogs that would follow humans across the continents. And all of this started with a simple evolutionary principle. Some wolves figured out that smiling, or at least not biting, got them snacks, the original treat-for-trick deal. By this stage in the Ice Age saga, humans and wolves had moved beyond tentative observation and cautious coexistence. Some wolves, the bold and clever ones, had earned the humans' trust, and humans in turn began noticing that these four-legged companions were far more than furry bystanders. They were potential partners in one of humanity's most vital undertakings, the hunt. Hunting in the Ice Age was no casual stroll with a bow and arrow. Prey included deer, bison, reindeer, and occasionally creatures as intimidating as mammoths. Humans relied on knowledge of migration patterns, terrain, and animal behavior, but even the smartest strategies couldn't guarantee a successful kill. That's where wolves became game changers. Wolves had incredible sensory perception. Their noses could track scents across miles of frozen tundra, their ears could detect the faintest rustle in the grass, and their eyes picked up subtle movements that humans might miss entirely. By following or cooperating with humans during hunts, wolves added an extra layer of surveillance that humans simply could not achieve on their own. A herd of reindeer might be grazing peacefully, unaware of the hunters circling from behind, until a wolf's growl or sudden sprint spooked the animals just enough to herd them toward human ambush points. This was more than passive assistance. Wolves could actively corner prey, anticipate escape routes, and coordinate with each other in ways that mirrored human hunting strategies. Humans, of course, didn't have an explicit plan for communication at first. There were no whistles, no hand signals, no game theory workshops. But over time they learned to interpret wolf behavior instinctively. If a wolf suddenly sprinted in a particular direction, the humans would follow, knowing the wolf had identified a weak or isolated animal. Likewise, humans could guide wolves toward areas where the prey would be easier to trap or exhaust. The results were dramatic. Hunting success rates increased significantly. Humans brought home more meat, and wolves benefited from access to scraps and partially butchered carcasses. Cooperation meant fewer failed hunts, fewer days going hungry, and less exposure to the deadly risks of solo hunting. Essentially, humans and wolves had stumbled upon a win-win strategy that nature had been testing for millennia. And the Ice Age prey? They didn't have a say. Imagine being a deer grazing on the tundra, thinking you're safe. Then, from nowhere, a coordinated team of bipeds and quadrupeds begins driving you toward a trap. Hunting with wolves meant more meat for everyone, except the deer, who suddenly started thinking moving to Florida wasn't such a bad idea. Interestingly, this stage of evolution also encouraged behavioral sophistication on both sides. Humans learned to predict which wolves were most reliable during hunts, which ones could handle proximity to prey without panicking, and which could follow cues without directly interfering. Wolves learned to watch human movements, adapt to their strategies, and recognize patterns of timing and positioning. Over generations, this mutual learning created animals that were increasingly adept at working alongside humans. The proto-dogs were evolving into highly efficient, cooperative hunting partners. This cooperation wasn't just about catching more prey, it also allowed humans to expand their hunting range. A lone human party might avoid certain areas due to predator density or difficult terrain, but wolves could mitigate some of those risks. Their keen senses, speed, and instinctive understanding of the environment meant that humans could venture further, explore new regions, and attempt bolder hunting strategies, all while having a furry, four-legged navigator along for the ride. Another advantage was energy efficiency. Chasing a herd across frozen plains is exhausting, and Ice Age humans had to conserve energy for survival tasks beyond hunting. Wolves, as natural endurance hunters, absorbed much of the workload in terms of tracking, chasing, and cornering prey. Humans could then strike when the prey was weakened or exhausted, drastically increasing the chances of a successful kill. In effect, wolves became mobile, furry hunting assistants, highly motivated, endlessly energetic, and far better at sniffing out a trail than any human could hope to be. Humorously, one can imagine early humans adjusting to their new partners with a mix of awe and frustration. A wolf sprinting off mid-chase might have been frustrating or terrifying, but it was almost always productive. Even the occasional food thief or overly eager wolf provided long-term benefits. Sure, it took my leg of venison, a hunter might mutter, but it also saved me from becoming breakfast for that giant cat lurking over the ridge. By the end of this phase, wolves were no longer just tolerated camp followers or curiosity seekers. They had become active participants in the hunt, shaping human strategies and survival outcomes. The Ice Age had forged a remarkable partnership, humans offering guidance, intelligence, and planning, wolves offering speed, instinct, and sheer physical prowess. Together, they created one of the earliest and most effective cooperative hunting teams in history, a proto-symbiosis that would eventually lay the groundwork for domestication and the inseparable human-dog bond we know today. In short, the hunt was no longer a solo struggle against nature. With wolves at their side, humans had allies who could track, corner, and protect, all without needing instructions. And in that frozen, unforgiving world, Having an ally who could smell danger, run faster, and sometimes steal your dinner was, quite literally, a life-saving advantage. By this point in the Ice Age, wolves weren't just hunting partners. They were becoming integral members of human camps. Their presence extended beyond the hunt, shaping daily life in ways that may have seemed small but were actually revolutionary for survival. These early proto-dogs provided protection, warmth, and companionship, turning freezing nights and predatory landscapes into something slightly more manageable. The first and perhaps most obvious role was guard duty. Nighttime in the Ice Age was a serious business. Darkness fell swiftly, and with it came predators, from wolves and saber-toothed cats to lurking bears and scavenging birds of prey. Humans had fire, yes, but even a roaring blaze could only illuminate a small radius. And let's be honest, staying awake all night to listen for danger while shivering was exhausting. Enter the wolves, naturally vigilant, equipped with sharp senses, and capable of detecting the slightest movement or unusual sound. A wolf's howl or growl could serve as an early warning system, alerting humans to approaching danger long before the predator reached camp. The advantage wasn't just practical, it was psychological. Knowing that a pack of sharp-eyed, alert animals circled the camp brought a sense of security. Humans could sleep more soundly, conserve energy, and face the next day's frozen tundra with a bit more confidence. In effect, wolves were living, breathing, slightly terrifying alarm clocks, and in some ways, the ultimate insurance policy against being eaten in the middle of the night. The next benefit was warmth. Ice Age nights could be brutal. Temperatures often plunged well below freezing, and wind-chilled conditions turned even the hardiest human into a shivering mess. Sleeping alone, bundled in furs, was uncomfortable at best and dangerous at worst. Wolves, however, provided a solution that was literally warm-blooded. Their bodies radiated heat, and huddling against one or two of these furry companions could raise a human's core temperature just enough to prevent frostbite or hypothermia. Picture a small Ice Age camp. Humans clustered around a dying fire, their breath fogging in the cold, and a few wolves nestled nearby. Eyes half closed but alert, tails flicking occasionally. They provided comfort, warmth, and protection, all at once, a living, breathing, slightly smelly blanket with teeth. Not exactly what you'd order at a modern bedding store, but effective nonetheless. Wolves also brought practical benefits beyond warmth and security. Their keen senses didn't switch off at night. While humans slept, wolves could pick up subtle changes in the environment. Distant animal calls, shifts in wind direction, or the presence of scavengers that might threaten stored food. They could alert humans to dangers without waking the entire camp, allowing proactive measures before an actual threat arrived. Over time, humans may have recognized patterns in wolf behavior that indicated different types of danger. A warning growl for one situation, a low whine for another. In essence, early humans were learning to read wolves, and wolves were learning to interpret human reactions in turn. There was also a social component to having wolves around the campfire. Humans are inherently social animals, and their survival often depended on group cohesion. Wolves, being pack animals themselves, fit seamlessly into this dynamic. Their presence reinforced cooperative behaviors, established routines, and even provided a kind of emotional companionship. Yes, these weren't cuddly lapdogs yet, no licking of faces or wagging tails of joy, but they offered a sense of shared vigilance and collective purpose. A wolf curled at your feet may not give you conversation, but it communicated an unspoken message. We survived together. Humorously, one can imagine the first humans learning how to deal with these campfire companions. You might reach over for your portion of meat, only to find a wolf's nose already inspecting it. You'd grumble, shoo it away, and eventually learn the rules of cohabitation, sharing scraps, respecting space, and occasionally tolerating unsolicited snuggles. It was a delicate balance of authority, negotiation, and trust, the beginnings of human-animal diplomacy. Another unexpected benefit was psychological comfort. Even in a harsh, frozen world, knowing that you weren't completely alone helped reduce stress and fear. The wolves' mere presence at the edge of the camp signaled that someone or something had your back, even if that someone had claws, teeth, and a penchant for stealing meat when you weren't looking. By this stage, it's clear that wolves were more than just hunting aids. They were multifunctional survival tools, guards, heaters, companions, and teachers of social cues. Humans were learning to depend on them, not just for food acquisition, but for everyday life in the Ice Age. A relationship built on mutual benefit, trust, and occasionally, the implicit understanding that shared warmth outweighed occasional meat theft. In short, early domesticated wolves were redefining what it meant to survive in a frozen world. They brought protection, warmth, and companionship to humans who had previously relied on fire, stone tools, and sheer stubbornness alone. And in return they gained food, shelter, and a place in the uniquely human social order. The campfire, once just a source of light and heat, became a shared hub where humans and wolves learned to coexist, awkwardly, cautiously, but effectively. Congratulations, you now own a living, breathing, slightly smelly blanket with teeth, and in the Ice Age, that was the closest thing to a luxury item humans could hope for. By the time humans and wolves had evolved from wary cohabitants to cooperative partners, the relationship had extended beyond mere survival. Wolves, now proto-dogs, had begun to occupy a remarkable place in human culture. Far from being just meat-sniffing companions, these early dogs became symbols, spiritual allies, and even members of human social structures, leaving traces in the archaeological record that tell us just how special they had become. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans in the Ice Age may have treated some wolves or early dogs with a degree of reverence. Sites across Eurasia show the remains of dogs buried alongside humans, often carefully interred rather than discarded. One famous site in Bonneber Castle, Germany, dating back around 14,000 years, contains the remains of 2 dogs alongside 2 humans. This isn't just casual coincidence. The deliberate placement implies a meaningful relationship. Humans wanted these animals to accompany them even in death. Apparently, even 14,000 years ago, people understood the ultimate truth. Who wants to spend the afterlife without their good boy? These burials hint at something deeper than companionship. Dogs may have held spiritual or symbolic significance. In harsh, unpredictable landscapes, animals that offered protection, guidance, and hunting assistance were more than tools. They were partners in survival, almost sacred in their utility and loyalty. Perhaps humans believed that these animals carried protective power into the afterlife, guarding their owners beyond the limits of mortality. Or maybe they simply wanted a furry friend to keep ghosts at bay. Either way, the archaeological record makes it clear wolves turned dogs were valued for more than food or warmth. Artistic evidence supports this cultural elevation. Ice Age cave paintings and carvings often depict animals with striking attention to detail, and some experts suggest that wolves or dogs appear in contexts that hint at their special status. While most depictions focus on prey animals like bison or horses, occasional carvings and figurines suggest humans were noting and appreciating the unique qualities of the wolves in their midst. Perhaps these artworks were more than mere observation. Maybe they reflected respect, admiration, or even affection. The animals that helped humans survive were worthy of being immortalized in stone. This cultural significance extended to practical and symbolic functions. Dogs could serve as intermediaries between humans and the natural world, guiding hunters, warning of predators, and even influencing group dynamics within human communities. Their social intelligence, loyalty, and responsiveness to human cues made them more than pets. They were collaborators in survival strategy, and in some ways collaborators in shaping human identity. Humans may have seen them as embodying qualities they admired: alertness, courage, and the ability to act in concert with the group. Humor also had its place. If dogs had any sense of timing back then, they probably knew how to exploit it. Archaeologists note evidence of food scraps buried near dogs in campsites, suggesting that humans shared meals with their companions, though likely begrudgingly. Imagine an Ice Age human grumbling, "Yes, you helped me catch that mammoth, but do you really need the best leg?" Even in the deep past, the push and pull between affection and annoyance may have been part of everyday life with a proto-dog. Dogs may also have served as living symbols of human ingenuity and social evolution. Unlike other predators, these animals had adapted to live alongside humans without posing constant lethal threats. Their presence may have reinforced communal bonds, taught cooperation, and encouraged empathy, subtly influencing early human culture. Over generations, humans and dogs shaped each other. Humans provided food, shelter, and protection. Dogs provided protection, warmth, hunting assistance, and social reinforcement. This reciprocal relationship extended beyond utility and into the realms of symbolism and identity. It's fascinating to consider that humans' reverence for dogs began so early. The burials and artistic representations suggest that humans intuitively recognized the unique role these animals played in survival, not just in a practical sense, but as companions with emotional and spiritual significance. Wolves that had been dangerous predators had become loyal allies, and humans in turn acknowledged their value with rituals, burials, and depictions in art. In a very real sense, dogs were among the first non-human participants in human culture, bridging the gap between utility, companionship, and symbolism. By combining spiritual significance, practical value, and social integration, these early dogs carved out a remarkable place in Ice Age life. They were not just tolerated or fed scraps, they were respected, commemorated, and immortalized alongside humans, and in doing so they became something no other wild animal had achieved: a permanent, meaningful role in human society. In short, proto-dogs had transformed from terrifying predators to trusted companions, hunters, and cultural icons. Humans had begun to recognize the extraordinary loyalty, intelligence, and utility of these animals, and archaeological evidence shows that this recognition extended to death and beyond. The relationship between humans and dogs had crossed a threshold, from mutual survival to cultural and symbolic significance. And of course, somewhere along the way, humans learned what we all intuitively know today: life and the afterlife is better with a good dog by your side. Apparently, even 14,000 years ago, people wanted to be buried with their pets because who wants to spend eternity without their good boy? By the time Ice Age humans and proto-dogs had formed stable hunting and campfire partnerships, the relationship began to leave a permanent mark, not just in cultural practices or behavior, but in the very DNA of wolves themselves. Over thousands of years, wolves that tolerated human presence underwent remarkable genetic changes, gradually transforming into the dogs we recognize today. Domestication is, at its core, a story of selective pressure. Wolves that were aggressive, overly fearful, or unwilling to coexist with humans tended not to thrive near camps. Bold, curious, and cooperative wolves were rewarded. They received food, shelter, protection, and the chance to reproduce. Over generations, these pressures amplified traits that favored cooperation, social intelligence, and reduced aggression toward humans. Essentially, humans unintentionally acted as evolutionary partners, guiding wolf populations toward a new path. The genetic differences between modern dogs and their wolf ancestors reflect this long process. Early dogs show modifications in genes related to digestion, temperament, and physical morphology. For instance, dogs evolved a better ability to digest starches, a dietary shift reflecting closer association with humans who often left partially processed plant foods or scraps behind. Wolves, in contrast, remained specialized carnivores. This adaptation not only changed physiology, but also cemented dogs' reliance on human communities for sustenance, further tightening the interspecies bond. Behavioral changes accompanied these genetic shifts. Wolves that had once relied purely on instinct and individual hunting strategies began exhibiting traits favoring social collaboration. Traits like reduced fear, greater tolerance of strangers, and sensitivity to human gestures became increasingly common. A wolf that could understand a pointing gesture or follow a human gaze had a survival advantage near camps. It gained access to food, protection, and reproductive opportunities. Over generations, these behavioral traits became embedded in the emerging dog lineage. Interestingly, Domestication also affected physical appearance. Early dogs often had smaller teeth, shorter snouts, and softer coats compared to wild wolves. Changes in body size and ear shape may have signaled approachability to humans, while reduced predatory features made these animals easier to integrate into camps. Even tail positioning evolved in ways that humans could interpret, providing subtle communication cues that reinforced cooperative behavior. Wolves that could smile without aggression, or signal friendliness with posture and tail wagging, were more likely to succeed in a human-centered world. This transformation wasn't instantaneous. The genetic and behavioral shifts took thousands of years, a slow accumulation of changes across countless generations. Each generation of wolves that lingered near humans had a slightly higher probability of survival, reproduction, and passing on genes favorable to domestication. Over time, the cumulative effect was dramatic. The wild predator became a companion, hunter assistant, and social partner. Humorously, one can imagine the early proto-dog in this process. One day, it's a top predator stalking reindeer across frozen plains. A few thousand years later, it's comfortably nestled by a fire, wearing a bundle of furs provided by humans, occasionally being nudged for treats. From apex hunter to cozy camp companion, evolution doesn't have a sense of irony, but if it did, it would surely chuckle at this transformation. One can almost picture an ancient wolf thinking, "I went from taking down prey with my bare teeth to wearing a sweater my human bought me." And they call this progress? Genetic studies also reveal that domestication favored social intelligence and responsiveness to humans over raw strength or hunting ability. Wolves capable of reading human gestures, responding to vocal commands, or tolerating human touch were more likely to thrive in close proximity to people. Over millennia, these traits became more pronounced, distinguishing domestic dogs from their wild cousins. While modern wolves rely primarily on instinct and pack dynamics within their own species, dogs adapted to the needs and expectations of a human social world. This genetic shift laid the foundation for the incredible diversity of dog breeds we see today. Variations in size, coat color, temperament, and physical traits all trace back to the early selection pressures imposed by humans and environmental adaptation. Tiny lapdogs, massive sled dogs, and specialized hunting companions are all distant descendants of the bold cooperative wolves that first approached human camps during the Ice Age. In short, the transformation from wolf to dog was a combination of natural selection, human-influenced pressures, and behavioral adaptation. Early humans didn't sit down with a checklist titled "How to Create a Pet," but by tolerating certain traits and rewarding cooperation, they effectively guided evolution. Wolves that could coexist, communicate, and collaborate with humans thrived, while others faded into the wild. Over thousands of years, this resulted in an entirely new species, the dog, genetically, behaviorally, and socially distinct from its wolf ancestors. And so the Ice Age predator became a domestic companion, proving that survival isn't just about strength or speed. Sometimes it's about social intelligence, patience, and the ability to adapt to a world dominated by bipedal hairless mammals with fire and slightly questionable table manners. One day you're a top predator. A few thousand years later, you're wearing a sweater your human bought you. Evolution has a sense of humor, even if it's hidden in your furry friend's wagging tail. By the time the Ice Age thawed and humans began transitioning from nomadic hunting to more settled lifestyles, one remarkable partnership had already reshaped the course of history: the alliance between humans and wolves. What began as a tentative truce around scraps and campfires had evolved into a multifaceted, enduring relationship. These early interactions laid the foundation for countless human innovations and survival strategies, and in many ways for the sheer continuation of humanity itself. The most immediate legacy of this partnership was the enhancement of human survival. Dogs, the descendants of Ice Age wolves, continued to aid hunting across generations. Their keen noses, tracking skills, and ability to coordinate during hunts provided humans with a hunting advantage that would have been impossible to achieve alone. Herding, flanking, and cornering prey became more efficient, and humans could attempt larger or more dangerous hunts with greater safety. In effect, dogs became natural extensions of human senses and physical abilities, allowing people to tackle challenges that would have otherwise been lethal or impractical. But the influence of dogs extended far beyond hunting. As human societies began to settle and cultivate land, dogs transitioned into new roles: guardians of villages, protectors of livestock, and companions in daily life. Guarding against predators, thieves, and rival groups, dogs became living alarm systems, alerting humans to danger before it could strike. Herding dogs shaped agricultural practices, helping humans control and manage domesticated animals. These capabilities were so transformative that it's not an exaggeration to say that dogs helped enable the growth of early civilizations. Human settlements without canine guardians would have faced significantly greater risk and perhaps slower societal development. This legacy also highlights one of humanity's smartest survival moves: forming partnerships rather than going it alone. The Ice Age wolf pact illustrates a simple yet profound principle. Survival often depends on collaboration. Humans could adapt their tools, strategies, and social structures, but adding another species into the mix, one with its own intelligence, instincts, and mobility, multiplied their effectiveness exponentially. This alliance not only improved hunting and protection, but also fostered innovation. Humans began to observe, anticipate, and even influence animal behavior systematically, planting the seeds for later animal husbandry, selective breeding, and domestication practices across multiple species. Dogs also left a lasting imprint on human culture and identity. They appeared in art, burial practices, and folklore, often symbolizing loyalty, courage, or guardianship. Ancient myths, stories, and traditions frequently featured dogs as protectors or companions, a reflection of their tangible impact on survival and social organization. The animals that had once been feared predators became cultural icons, embedded in human consciousness as trusted allies. Even today, dogs retain that dual role, helpers and companions, still tied to the legacy of cooperation first forged in the frozen tundras of the Ice Age. Humorously, one can imagine the Ice Age humans reflecting on their furry collaborators. Without these wolves, they might have mused, we might have starved, been eaten by predators, or frozen to death. And now, we also have to put up with someone chewing on our shoes. Yes, the domesticated dog brought loyalty, warmth, and survival benefits, but it also introduced minor inconveniences that every modern dog owner knows all too well. The pact may have been life-saving, but it came with teeth, tails, and a healthy dose of mischief. The evolutionary and societal effects of the Ice Age wolf pact ripple through history. From hunting and protection in prehistoric times to herding, companionship, and specialized work in early civilizations, dogs became indispensable partners. Their presence allowed humans to expand territories, exploit new resources, and build communities in environments that would otherwise have been far more dangerous or inhospitable. Essentially, dogs acted as enablers. Their partnership allowed humans to transform from vulnerable hunter-gatherers into resourceful, adaptive, and resilient populations. Beyond practical advantages, the wolf-human alliance fostered a deeper understanding of interspecies cooperation. Humans learned to observe and interpret the behaviors of another species, refine selective breeding practices, and establish social hierarchies that accommodated non-human allies. This laid the groundwork for later domestication efforts across other species, from livestock to horses, profoundly shaping human civilization. In many ways, Ice Age humans' first careful experiments with wolves were the blueprint for humanity's long-term strategy of shaping and coexisting with other species for mutual benefit. Ultimately, the Ice Age wolf pact represents more than just survival. It is a story of foresight, adaptability, and social ingenuity. Humans who learned to coexist, collaborate, and reward cooperative traits in wolves gained a strategic edge that would echo through generations. Their descendants inherited not only the tools, shelters, and social networks of early civilizations, but also the ever-present companionship and utility of dogs, a living legacy that persists in every wagging tail today. In short, The Ice Age wolf-human alliance wasn't just a quirky historical anecdote, it was a pivotal survival strategy, a catalyst for societal development, and the foundation for a bond that remains unbroken. Without dogs, we might not have made it, and you wouldn't have anyone to blame for chewing up your shoes. Ferdinand Magellan. Say the name out loud, and it rolls off the tongue like a mysterious spell, conjuring visions of uncharted oceans, ferocious storms, and sailors who wished they'd stayed home knitting instead. Born in 1480 in Portugal, Magellan was not your average polite merchant or quiet navigator. No, he was a man fueled by ambition, stubbornness, and a peculiar talent for convincing other people to risk their lives for his ideas. Essentially, he was history's first self-appointed, "my idea is better than yours" guy. And somehow he made it work, mostly. From an early age, Magellan displayed a curious combination of bravery and obsession. He was fascinated by the world beyond Portugal's shores, spending countless hours poring over maps that were as much fantasy as fact. At a time when Europe's understanding of the world was, let's say, flexible, he imagined routes no one else dared to dream of. Ships had just begun cautiously skirting the coasts of Africa and Asia, and maps often looked more like treasure hunting guides drawn by a particularly creative child than accurate representations of reality. Mountains in the wrong places? Rivers that doubled as dragons' lairs? Check. Oceans that ended abruptly in the middle of nowhere? Absolutely. And yet Magellan looked at these maps and saw possibility. His obsession was simple, if slightly audacious: find a westward route to the Spice Islands. The Spice Islands, today part of Indonesia, were considered the holy grail of the early 16th century global economy. Spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace were worth more than gold, literally. 1 gram of nutmeg could make a nobleman swoon, and cloves were basically currency. Europe's hunger for these magical flavor boosters was insatiable, and the traditional route around Africa, controlled by Portugal, was long, dangerous, and monopolized. Magellan, being the clever and stubborn man he was, decided the solution was to sail west across the unknown, because why not complicate things further? Now here's where Magellan's genius collides with his sheer audacity. At the time, many Europeans believed the Earth was round, but only in theory. Some were still clinging to older, flatter models, mostly because it made life simpler and less terrifying. Magellan, however, was a believer in the spherical model, and more importantly, in taking bold action. "We'll sail west," he told anyone who would listen, "and we'll reach the Spice Islands by going where no European has gone before." His contemporaries were polite, skeptical, and probably a little terrified. Many secretly hoped he was joking, others loudly disagreed, suggesting that sailing west was a surefire way to fall off the edge of the world, be eaten by sea monsters, or simply get lost forever. But Magellan, as history would record, had a remarkable talent for convincing a few wealthy investors that yes, he was entirely serious, and yes, it was worth funding a potentially fatal voyage. And that's the context of early 1500s Europe, a continent hungry for adventure, wealth, and flavor. The age of discovery was in full swing. Spain and Portugal were locked in a delicate dance of competition, claiming territories, plotting routes, and occasionally inventing imaginary islands to impress the king. The world, from a European perspective, was simultaneously enormous and vaguely terrifying. Navigation tools existed, but not in the sense we understand today. Compasses were finicky, maps were approximations, and sailors frequently mistook clouds for land or whales for islands. And yet, in this chaotic, sometimes comical milieu, Magellan stood firm. He had a vision of the world as a connected whole, a globe that could be circumnavigated if you had courage, ambition, and ideally, a touch of insanity. Of course, the man was not without his quirks. Magellan's personality was as sharp as a cutlass. He could be charming, persuasive, and inspiring, but also infuriating, relentless, and stubborn to a fault. Crew members would later describe him as someone who never wavered once he believed he was right, which is fantastic if you're following him. Less so if you're seasick and wondering why there isn't a tavern anywhere nearby. He was a visionary, yes, but also a man whose confidence teetered on the edge of obsession. In other words, if you were thinking of joining his crew, you weren't signing up for a casual stroll across calm seas, you were signing up for an adventure led by someone whose motto might as well have been, "The earth is round, your complaints are irrelevant." And so the stage was set. Magellan, armed with ambition, stubbornness, and a map that could double as a piece of abstract art, prepared to lead a fleet into uncharted waters. Europe was eager for the riches of the Spice Islands, and Magellan promised to deliver by force of will if nothing else. The world beyond Spain's shores waited, vast and mysterious, filled with storms, islands, and perils no sailor could fully imagine. Magellan believed the earth was round. Some people disagreed, others just hoped he was kidding. Little did anyone know, this was the beginning of a journey that would test human endurance, sanity, and the limits of polite disagreement. Magellan's dream was grand. His methods were audacious, and his story, absolutely ridiculous in the best way possible. If the last part was about Magellan's audacious ideas, this part is about how he turned those ideas into something terrifyingly real. A fleet of 5 ships and 270 men, none of whom were exactly thrilled to be trapped together in a floating metal coffin for years. In other words, hiring for this voyage was less adventurous exploration and more a cross between Craigslist Survivor and a bad group project in high school, except with swords and scurvy. Let's start with the fleet itself. The ships were a motley assortment, each with its own personality and quirks. There was the Trinidad, the flagship which carried Magellan and most of his supplies. She was supposed to be the brain of the operation, sturdy, reliable, and capable of handling rough seas, but in reality, she had the tendency to groan ominously whenever anyone looked at her funny. Then came the San Antonio, a nimble ship built for speed, but also prone to occasional mutinous thoughts of its own, as would be revealed later. Concepcion was the medium-sized workhorse, neither particularly fast nor especially slow, but she had a weirdly persistent leak that earned her the nickname the Drip. The Victoria, which would eventually complete the circumnavigation, was initially the least glamorous ship, a sturdy little vessel with no illusions about grandeur. And finally the Santiago, meant for exploration and scouting, which had an unfortunate habit of crashing into rocks, presumably out of sheer excitement. By modern standards, it's safe to say these ships were less naval engineering marvels and more floating IKEA furniture held together with hope and sea salt. And then there were the men. Imagine gathering a group of people who mostly dislike each other, stuffing them into confined quarters, throwing in extreme weather, minimal hygiene, and a diet of spoiled salted meat, and then asking them to cooperate for years on end. That's pretty much what Magellan signed up for. The crew was an eclectic mix of Portuguese and Spanish sailors, navigators who could read the stars but not each other's moods, and a handful of specialists like carpenters, gunners, and cooks, who were desperately hoping the trip wouldn't last long enough for them to starve. Adding to the chaos, loyalties were split. Spain and Portugal were rivals on good days and frenemies on bad, so internal tension was baked into the recipe. Crew selection was, let's call it, flexible. Many of the men signed up out of genuine curiosity or ambition, but just as many joined because they were conscripted, coerced, or simply had no other prospects. Some had personal grudges against Magellan or his officers, others had grudges against literally everyone else. By the time the fleet set sail, it was essentially a floating powder keg. One wrong spark, and mutiny, chaos, or both could erupt. The fact that anyone survived is, in hindsight, remarkable. Space aboard the ships was predictably cramped. Sailors lived cheek by jowl in small cabins or open decks, often forced to share bunks and meals. Privacy was non-existent. Personal hygiene was a polite suggestion rather than an enforceable rule. Disease and vermin were constant companions. Rats, lice, and the occasional unwelcome seabird made daily life a living nightmare. Yet somehow, despite all these conditions, the fleet sailed. How? Mostly because Magellan was both terrifyingly charismatic and terrifyingly authoritarian. Orders were absolute, punishment swift, and morale, well, let's just say morale consisted mostly of grumbling and hope that breakfast would eventually arrive. Supplies were another challenge entirely. Water and food had to last for months at a time, and preservation techniques were primitive at best. Salted meat, dried legumes and stale bread were the staples, punctuated occasionally by questionable canned goods, though canned goods as we know them today were still centuries away. So imagine a lot of old jerky. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare, which meant scurvy loomed as an invisible, relentless threat. Magellan's leadership had to balance logistics, navigation and morale in a way that would make modern project managers weep. The fleet's organization was designed with military precision, yet human nature has a habit of interfering with even the best-laid plans. Officers were assigned to each ship, but their authority was constantly challenged. Sailors bickered, complained, and occasionally staged open rebellion, though they usually failed spectacularly thanks to Magellan's iron will. The hierarchy was clear, but the enforcement was, let's say, creative. There were rules, punishments, and the occasional execution, but mostly survival depended on a mix of obedience, luck, and the ability to ignore the smell. Finally, it's worth noting the sheer psychological strain of assembling this fleet. Magellan had to convince investors, officers, and sailors alike that this voyage was not only necessary but achievable. He had to navigate politics, personal grudges, and the constant whisperings of men who thought he was completely insane. And yet, by some combination of charm, authority, and sheer audacity, he did it. The fleet set sail, a precarious assembly of ships and men, bound together by a single vision: circumnavigate the globe or die trying. By the time the last anchor was lifted, the fleet of 5 ships, each with its own quirks, leaks, and mutinous tendencies, was ready to face the unknown. Magellan's misfit crew was in every sense a floating microcosm of Europe itself, ambitious, competitive, and occasionally terrifying. The stage was set for disaster, glory, or both. And just to remind you, while this was all happening, breakfast remained an unpredictable ordeal. Scurvy was lurking, and everyone secretly wondered if the ocean had a sense of humor. Hiring for the voyage, think Craigslist meets Survivor, but with swords and scurvy. If assembling the misfit fleet was the appetizer, the first mutiny was the main course, served raw, bitter, and with a side of panic. Long before Magellan's fleet had a chance to taste the salt spray of the Atlantic, tensions were bubbling like a cauldron left unattended on a pirate ship stove. The problem wasn't just cramped quarters, bad food, or seasickness. It was politics, personality clashes, and the fact that a significant number of the crew actively disliked each other before they even set sail. You see, Magellan's fleet was a combustible mix of nationalities and egos. Spanish and Portuguese sailors were crammed onto the same ships, and this was less cultural exchange and more a simmering rivalry waiting for ignition. Portugal, Magellan's homeland, had reluctantly given him leave to serve Spain, which made some Portuguese crew members grumble that they were following a man who had, in their eyes, betrayed his own country. The Spanish sailors, meanwhile, were suspicious of Magellan's motives. Was he leading them into glory, or straight into the ocean's waiting jaws? Alliances and resentments were forming faster than a storm cloud on the horizon, and everyone's patience was thinner than the rope that tied the sails together. Food shortages didn't help. Imagine months of salted meat so tough you could use it as a hammer, hardtack that could shatter teeth, and water that was either brackish or suspiciously slimy. Sailors were hungry, dehydrated, and desperate, which makes arguments over leadership, direction, and the correct way to tie a knot feel a lot more intense. One man's "tie it like this" became a reason to question whether the captain's judgment was sound. Tiny disagreements, magnified by misery, quickly became full-blown grievances. The mutiny itself began subtly: whispers, side-eye glances, and secret meetings below deck. By the time Magellan got wind of it, some officers were openly challenging his orders, and a few sailors had already plotted to seize one of the ships. To call it mutiny before breakfast wasn't an exaggeration. In fact, breakfast had long since lost its relevance. The real morning ritual was watching who would get in trouble first, and whether the offending sailors might end up swimming with the fishes, or at least scrubbing the deck until they wished they were. Magellan's response was effective. He combined firm authority, strategic intimidation, and what could only be called psychological warfare. He summoned the mutineers, not with gentle words or polite negotiation, but with the kind of presence that made even seasoned sailors reconsider their life choices. He reminded them of the stakes: hostile oceans, endless storms, disease, and the simple fact that survival was dependent on unity or obedience, which was basically the same thing in Magellan's world. The captain's calm, confident, and slightly terrifying demeanor was enough to unnerve even the most obstinate complainers. But Magellan didn't stop at intimidation. He employed tactical punishments designed to both discipline and demoralize. Leaders of the mutiny were marooned temporarily, confined or reassigned in humiliating ways, while the rest of the crew was left to witness the consequences. It was psychological theater at sea, a reminder that dissent would be met not just with punishment, but with a careful, almost surgical humiliation designed to make the message stick. By the time the mutiny was officially over, people were whispering among themselves that Magellan must have a PhD in "Don't mess with me." Some even suspected he had magical powers, because a few hours earlier they had been ready to revolt, and now they were polishing the deck voluntarily. Interestingly, the mutiny also highlighted another aspect of Magellan's leadership: his ability to blend severity with practical incentive. He didn't merely punish, he also offered the promise of reward for loyalty, reminding sailors that those who followed orders were more likely to survive storms, find food, and avoid being left behind on some distant island. It was a delicate balance of fear and hope, administered with precision. By the end of the episode, the crew had learned two things: don't question the captain openly, and always hope breakfast somehow arrives before mutiny becomes mandatory. The ripple effects of the mutiny weren't limited to immediate survival. They set a precedent for discipline throughout the voyage. Magellan's handling of the situation sent a message: this was not a leisurely cruise. The oceans were unforgiving, life was fragile, and insubordination could get you killed, stranded, or at least very, very wet. Sailors quickly realized that the only way to make it through this voyage was to follow orders, suppress personal grudges, and pray that the next mutiny, if there was one, was somewhere far from deck, preferably in a location with fewer splinters and more sand. Of course, the mutiny also revealed the human cost of exploration. These men were not only contending with the physical perils of the ocean, but also with mental strain, boredom, fear, and frustration magnified by months at sea. It's worth noting that the mutiny could have escalated into disaster, and yet it didn't. The combination of Magellan's authority, strategic punishment, and sheer willingness to stare down defiance ensured the fleet stayed mostly intact, at least for the moment. By the time breakfast or whatever passed for it finally arrived, the crew had learned that life at sea under Magellan would be unpredictable, harsh, and occasionally terrifying, but it would also be impossibly ridiculously memorable. There would be storms, starvation, and challenges far worse than a few rebellious sailors. But at least for now, the fleet had survived its first real trial. The first mutiny was crushed so efficiently. People started whispering that Magellan had a PhD in "Don't mess with me." By the time Magellan's fleet left the relative safety of Spain's coast, the misfit crew had survived mutinies, disagreements, and the awkward realities of shared bunks. But as they crossed the Atlantic towards South America, they were about to discover that the ocean had a sense of humor, and that humor came in the form of storms, hunger, and relentless nausea. The Atlantic was far less polite than the harbor at Seville. Strong winds, unpredictable currents, and sudden squalls made the ocean a constantly moving obstacle course. Waves towered like miniature mountains, tossing the ships from side to side, and gusts of wind tore at sails with a force that could rip both timber and pride. The crew quickly learned that the Atlantic didn't care about your plans, your maps, or your neatly packed cargo. It was a lesson in humility delivered by cold spray and the occasional deck-swamping wave. Then there was the matter of seasickness. Modern medicine still hasn't entirely solved this problem, and 16th century remedies were more superstition than science. Sailors clutched buckets, prayed to saints, and occasionally tried to cure nausea with strong spirits, all with varying success. For many, The first few weeks at sea were spent in a haze of dizziness, pallor, and muttered curses. Some sailors were too weak to climb the rigging, too nauseated to eat, and too stubborn to admit that the ocean was winning. It was as if the sea itself had a secret league of tiny ninjas whose sole purpose was to assault stomachs until morale broke. Food, unfortunately, did little to improve the situation. Provisions consisted mainly of salted meat, hardtack, dried legumes, and whatever else had survived weeks in barrels. By this point, the salted meat had hardened into something resembling leather. Eating it required not just teeth but determination, and even then the flavor was distinctive. Spoilage was a constant threat. Sailors would open a barrel of beans only to find it crawling with maggots or emitting an odor that could make a strong man faint. Fresh fruits and vegetables were non-existent for months at a time, which meant scurvy was beginning to silently stalk the fleet. Funny beat. Salted meat is great if you're a vampire. Otherwise, think chewing old leather while hoping you don't die first. Water was equally problematic. Stored in wooden barrels, it grew stale quickly, developed a murky taste, and often contained unwelcome organisms. Sailors had to ration it carefully, sometimes drinking what could best be described as flavored by the ocean. A lucky few managed to catch rainwater, but rainfall was unpredictable, so hydration often depended on endurance, hope, and a willingness to ignore the occasional floating debris. And then there were the rats. These small, nimble, relentless creatures became the fleet's unofficial mascots, or more accurately, its uninvited overlords. Rats gnawed at food, ran along rigging, and occasionally startled crew members mid-shift. They were everywhere, a constant reminder that no matter how carefully the ships were provisioned, nature had other plans. Tiny ninjas indeed. Sailors would sometimes awake to find a rat perched on their chest, staring with the confidence of a king surveying his domain. Resistance was futile. At some point the men accepted that rat ownership was part of the nautical experience. Storms were the cruelest teacher of all. The ships were tossed like toys in waves that seemed endless, forcing sailors to cling desperately to anything that wouldn't float away. Lightning crackled, thunder boomed, and sails shredded under the force of gusts. Fear became a constant companion. Many sailors feared the storm more than starvation, mutiny, or scurvy combined. Navigation in these conditions was a delicate dance. One wrong turn could send a ship onto hidden rocks or into a vortex of waves that promised a watery grave. Magellan, meanwhile, remained the unflappable center of command, issuing orders with calm precision, as if the storm was simply a minor inconvenience rather than a full-scale assault on life, limb, and breakfast. Despite all of this, the crew pressed onward. Storms passed eventually, and even the hungriest, most nauseated sailors learned to adapt. Life at sea was brutal, unforgiving, and occasionally absurdly funny. A man chewing leather-like meat while a rat scuttled across his shoulder, all while gripping a rope to avoid being washed overboard, is a scene that could have inspired centuries of sailor jokes, and probably did in some form. Crossing the Atlantic also offered fleeting moments of wonder. The endless horizon, star-filled skies, and the sight of distant shores promised that survival wasn't impossible. But for every beautiful sunrise, there was a storm, a spoiled barrel of food, or a wave crashing over the deck. The crew learned, sometimes painfully, that endurance at sea was a mix of courage, stubbornness, and a willingness to ignore nearly everything your senses were telling you. By the time Magellan's fleet approached the coast of South America, the men had been tested physically, mentally, and gastronomically. They were seasick, hungry, and slightly rat-obsessed, but they were also seasoned enough to handle whatever the next stage of the journey would throw at them. Storms, starvation, and seasickness had claimed morale and patience in equal measure, but the fleet remained afloat, and that in itself was an accomplishment worth noting. Salted meat is great if you're a vampire. Otherwise, think chewing old leather while hoping you don't die first. After months at sea battling storms, hunger, and the persistent judgmental stares of rats, Magellan's fleet finally approached the southern tip of South America. What lay ahead was a geographic puzzle that would test navigation skills, patience, and, in all likelihood, sanity. the Strait of Magellan. To modernize, it's a relatively narrow stretch of water connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But in 1520, it was an uncharted labyrinth, a winding maze of channels, islands, and treacherous currents. For Magellan and his men, it was a test of endurance and wits, an obstacle course designed by Mother Nature herself with a particularly mischievous sense of humor. The strait was discovered almost by accident, or, if you prefer, by stubbornness. Magellan had reasoned that there must be some passage connecting the two oceans, because it made logical sense, and maps often lied about such things. The crew, less confident, had a different theory. The ocean hates us, and there is no escape. As the fleet approached the tip of Tierra del Fuego, the waters narrowed, wind patterns grew unpredictable, and fog settled like a ghostly curtain over the ships. Visibility dropped to mere feet in some places, and every turn seemed to present a new set of challenges. Hidden rocks, strong cross-currents, and islands that appeared on maps as though someone had doodled them in the margin. Navigation through the strait was a constant exercise in tension and imagination. Charts of the region were virtually non-existent, so Magellan relied on a combination of dead reckoning, compass bearings, and a healthy dose of intuition. Every bend presented the possibility of disaster. One wrong turn and a ship could be dashed against a rocky shore, trapped in a narrow channel, or caught in whirlpools strong enough to swallow men and supplies whole. The crews had to continuously adjust sails, shift ballast, and constantly scan the horizon for subtle signs of danger. For sailors already weary from months at sea, every day felt like an eternity in a watery maze. The strait itself was not merely a narrow channel. It was a series of twisting passages, wide bays, shallow sandbanks, and hidden inlets. Fog hung in the air like a permanent curtain, turning navigation into a combination of guesswork and prayer. Currents moved unpredictably, sometimes pushing ships backward or sideways despite the crew's best efforts. At one point, Magellan reportedly considered sending scouts ahead in small boats to chart the way. But even then, visibility was so poor that they might have been chasing shadows. Every bend prompted a collective holding of breath. Sailors whispered about curses, sea spirits, and the possibility that the ocean had decided to get revenge for months of human intrusion. Morale in the fleet during this 38-day passage was complicated. On one hand, there was the thrill of discovery. No European had ever successfully navigated this passage, and the sense of achievement was enormous. On the other hand, the tedium, constant danger, and sheer unpredictability made even seasoned sailors question their life choices. Fog, cold, and the endless twists of the channels made it impossible to rest properly. Meals were as meager and unpleasant as ever, and the sense of being trapped in a natural labyrinth added a psychological dimension to their physical exhaustion. It was less adventure and more extreme outdoor escape room with no exit. One of the enduring legends of this part of the journey involves the occasional navigational missteps, or as we might call them today, oops, wrong turn. Ships would sometimes enter side channels, only to find themselves blocked by cliffs or islands, requiring backtracking under increasingly difficult conditions. Every miscalculation meant wasted days, depleted supplies, and a crew growing steadily more desperate. It is a testament to Magellan's leadership that the fleet remained mostly intact, despite frequent complaints, grumbling, and mutinous whispers. He guided them through each new obstacle with a combination of experience, intuition, and unwavering determination. Another challenge was the weather. The southern tip of South America is notorious for sudden storms, heavy rains, and gusting winds that could capsize even the sturdiest vessel. The fleet encountered freezing temperatures, relentless rain, and gusts that tore at sails and rigging. Crews had to work continuously to keep the ships afloat and moving, often while soaked to the bone and shivering. The cold and exhaustion added another layer of difficulty to an already punishing journey. Despite all these hardships, the passage offered glimpses of natural beauty that were both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Jagged cliffs, towering mountains, and dense forests loomed over the water, reminding the crew that they were exploring territory utterly unknown to Europeans. For Magellan, it was a moment of triumph. The strait was navigable, however narrow and treacherous, and it offered a route to the Pacific that had eluded all prior explorers. For the crew, it was a mix of relief, exhaustion, and quiet panic, mostly directed at the next bend in the water. It took 38 days to sail the strait. Today, Google Maps would just tell you to U-turn. By the end of this grueling passage, the fleet had achieved something remarkable. They had conquered the labyrinthine Strait of Magellan, proving that there was a route to the Pacific from the Atlantic, and gaining experience that would prove essential for the remainder of their journey. But it came at a cost: frayed nerves, sore muscles, and a growing, if grudging, respect for the natural forces that had created such a complex and treacherous waterway. The strait would forever bear Magellan's name, a lasting testament to his determination, audacity, and the sheer stubbornness required to navigate what seemed an impossible maze. If the Strait of Magellan was a labyrinth, the Pacific Ocean was an endless void. After navigating the treacherous southern tip of South America, Magellan's fleet entered the vast open Pacific, an expanse so enormous that it defied comprehension, even for seasoned sailors. For 3 months, the men drifted over waters that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, their minds slowly unspooling under the pressure of monotony, hunger, and the ever-present threat of scurvy. The Pacific was a test unlike any other. Unlike the Atlantic, which had coastlines to guide them, the Pacific offered nothing but horizon and waves, an unbroken mirror of blue that made it easy to forget the concept of land entirely. For the crew, navigation became a psychological challenge as much as a practical one. Sailors began to lose track of time, marking days not by the sun or the stars, but by the gradual deterioration of their supplies and the increasing ratio of rats to humans. Sleep was broken by waves lashing the decks, groaning timbers, and the occasional sailor vomiting over the side, which quickly became a common auditory landscape. Food shortages reached crisis levels. Fresh provisions were long gone, replaced by the familiar diet of salted meat, hardtack, and whatever oddities survived months in barrels. Fresh fruit and vegetables were non-existent, meaning scurvy, the slow creeping killer of sailors, took hold. Gums bled, joints ached, teeth loosened, and morale plummeted in a chorus of moans and complaints. Water, too, was rationed tightly, and even when rain fell, capturing it was a labor-intensive task. The fleet, floating in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, was essentially a desperate science experiment in human endurance. And yet, the Pacific wasn't entirely merciless. On rare occasions, pods of dolphins appeared, flying fish skimmed the surface, and birds occasionally signaled the approach of land. But these moments of relief were fleeting, often causing more confusion than comfort. Sailors, delirious from hunger and heat, sometimes misidentified clouds or flocks of birds as islands, only to discover that hope could be cruelly deceptive. One crew member, so desperate for a glimpse of land, reportedly attempted to hug a cloud, a gesture that must have made onlookers both worried and slightly jealous of his optimism. The psychological toll of this voyage cannot be overstated. For months the sailors faced a horizon so monotonous it became almost a character in itself. Vast, indifferent, and terrifying. Conversations often devolved into complaints about food, personal grievances, or speculative debates about whether the Pacific would ever end. Some sailors took to talking to the waves as if they were sentient beings, pleading for mercy or guidance. Magellan, ever the steady captain, understood the danger of despair and sought to maintain order with a mix of discipline, routine, and occasionally dry humor. He reminded men of the ultimate goal, the Spice Islands, but also acknowledged the absurdity of their situation in ways that quietly bolstered morale. Land eventually appeared in the form of Guam, marking the first European sighting of this island. The relief among the crew was immense, even if temporary. Fresh water, fruits, and shade promised a reprieve from the relentless monotony and physical degradation of the ocean crossing. The encounter with Guam was not just a logistical necessity, but a psychological lifeline, a reminder that the world was vast, yes, but not infinite in a way that would permanently trap them. For sailors who had been at sea for months without significant respite, the appearance of land was akin to seeing the end of a very long, very unpleasant tunnel. After Guam, The fleet continued toward the Philippines, another first for Europeans. These islands were lush, populated and vibrant, a stark contrast to the barren monotony of the Pacific waters they had endured. The sight of inhabited lands rekindled hope, but it also introduced new challenges: diplomacy with local communities, cultural misunderstandings, and the temptation to believe that they had finally reached the end of hardship. For Magellan, it was a delicate balance, securing provisions while keeping the crew disciplined and focused on the ultimate mission. Despite the hardships, the crossing of the Pacific cemented the fleet's endurance and resilience. The journey demonstrated the limits of human patience, the severity of oceanic isolation, and the creeping threat of scurvy and malnutrition. It also highlighted Magellan's leadership, his ability to maintain order, motivate men through extreme adversity, and guide them through an expanse that few had even imagined crossing. The Pacific was vast, indifferent, and punishing. But under Magellan's command, the fleet survived, and in doing so made history. The Pacific was so big the sailors started forgetting what land looked like. One even tried to hug a cloud. By the time the fleet approached the Philippines, they were a battle-hardened, sunburned, and increasingly desperate group, bonded by shared suffering and a growing appreciation for fresh food. The Pacific Ocean had tested every aspect of their endurance, physical, mental, and emotional, but they had emerged alive, if not entirely sane. The vastest body of water on Earth had been crossed, and the Spice Islands were tantalizingly within reach, bringing both hope and the next set of challenges. After months of ocean-crossing misery and near starvation, Magellan's fleet finally reached the Philippine archipelago in March of 1521. Landfall brought both relief and renewed anxiety. Fresh water, fruits and shade were available, but so were new dangers that no European sailor had ever encountered. The islands were lush and populated, with vibrant cultures, established villages, and local leaders with their own agendas. For the fleet, the Philippines represented both salvation and complication, a paradox that would prove fatal for their leader. Magellan, ever ambitious and eager to impress, quickly involved himself in local politics. He sought alliances with certain chieftains, particularly Raja Humabon of Cebu, hoping that cooperation could provide food, labor, and strategic advantage. Magellan's reasoning was simple. If he could secure local support, it would ease the voyage to the Spice Islands and demonstrate European superiority in diplomacy and firepower. What he underestimated was the complexity of inter-island politics, rivalries, and the tendency of some conflicts to escalate faster than a barrel of hardtack in the sun. The Europeans' arrival inevitably disrupted the balance of power. While some local leaders welcomed trade and protection, others viewed Magellan's armed men with suspicion. Weapons, unfamiliar tactics, and strange clothing contributed to an atmosphere of tension that was as thick as the tropical humidity. Sailors, still recovering from months at sea, were poorly equipped to navigate diplomacy or armed combat in an unfamiliar terrain. Meanwhile, Magellan, convinced of his own charisma and the righteousness of his mission, pressed forward with plans to assert influence, unaware that danger was approaching faster than a tropical storm. The fatal encounter came at Mactan, where Magellan sought to support Raja Humabon against a rival chieftain, Lapu-Lapu. Confident in the superiority of his Spanish armor and European weaponry, Magellan underestimated both the terrain and the resolve of his opponents. The shallow waters and coral reefs hindered the movement of his men, while the native warriors fighting on familiar ground used agility, spears, and clever tactics to their advantage. Magellan's carefully planned strategy quickly unraveled into chaos, confusion, and ultimately tragedy. During the battle, Magellan was struck multiple times and killed, a blow not only to the fleet's command structure but also to morale. For men who had endured storms, starvation, mutinies, and endless seasickness, the sudden loss of their captain was devastating. Fear, grief, and uncertainty rippled through the remaining crew. Without their leader, decision-making became frantic, and panic threatened to overwhelm the already exhausted men. Some whispered about retreat, others considered revenge, but all recognized the fragility of their situation. Survival, after months of endurance, suddenly seemed precarious. The death of Magellan also forced the fleet to confront the unpredictability of exploration. Maps, charts, and careful planning could not account for the complexities of human conflict or local resistance. The sailors, who had spent months perfecting navigation and rationing provisions, suddenly realized that no amount of seamanship could protect them from the realities of foreign politics. The lesson was harsh. Exploration was not just about discovering new lands, it was about surviving encounters with people who had every right to defend their own territories. In the aftermath of Magellan's death, leadership shifted among the remaining officers, command was divided, strategies reconsidered, and a sense of urgency replaced the confidence that had guided the voyage. Sailors were forced to cope with not only the emotional shock of losing their captain, but also the practical necessity of continuing the journey. They had to make difficult decisions about where to sail, how to navigate hostile territories, and how to ration dwindling supplies, all while grappling with grief, fear, and a growing sense that the Spice Islands might never be reached. Despite the tragedy, the fleet pressed on. The loss of Magellan became both a cautionary tale and a rallying point. The men had survived the impossible so far, and they were determined, if not particularly enthusiastic, to see the mission through. Their captain's fate served as a grim reminder that leadership, courage, and audacity could only go so far against the realities of geography, weather, and human resistance. Survival required adaptation, cooperation, and at times sheer stubbornness, the qualities that had carried them across oceans and would now carry them toward the next phase of their journey. Magellan may have died, but his travel insurance clearly did not cover exotic local skirmishes. The Philippines marked the turning point of the expedition. Magellan, whose vision had inspired an entire fleet, was no longer present to guide, motivate, or intimidate. The remaining crew, a mix of Portuguese and Spanish sailors still bound by oath and survival instinct, faced the dual challenge of mourning a leader and making strategic decisions in an unfamiliar, potentially hostile environment. It was a lesson in the cost of ambition and the unpredictability of exploration. Even the most audacious plans could be undone by circumstances that no map, compass, or weather report could predict. By the time the fleet departed the Philippines, they were forever changed. Magellan's death was a loss of leadership, but it also strengthened the resolve of the remaining sailors. They had faced mutiny, storms, starvation, and the open Pacific, and now they had confronted the deadly reality of foreign conflict. Each man carried the memory of Magellan's courage, the weight of survival, and the faint hope that despite all odds they might still return home to tell the tale. After more than 3 years at sea, navigating storms, mutinies, scurvy, and the occasional existential crisis, Magellan's ambitious expedition was finally winding toward its conclusion, or at least what counted as a conclusion when fewer than 20 of the original 270 men remained alive. Only one ship, the Victoria, would eventually make it back to Spain, captained by Juan Sebastián Elcano, a man whose name is often overshadowed by Magellan's but whose skills ensured the mission's completion. The Victoria's return was the literal and figurative end of an era. After circumnavigating the globe, the survivors could attest to what everyone else had assumed but never seen. The world was round, impossibly large, and very, very wet. Oceans stretched further than the imagination could conceive. Islands appeared and vanished like mirages, and every sailor had experienced firsthand that endurance, courage, and a stubborn refusal to die were prerequisites for exploration. The journey home was hardly luxurious. The surviving crew members were emaciated, their bodies scarred by months of malnutrition, disease, and hard labor. Their once bright uniforms were tattered and salt-stiffened, and their eyes carried the haunted look of men who had stared into the abyss and found that the abyss had snacks, but it didn't share. Yet they sailed on, guided by maps, stars, and sheer stubbornness. The taste of fresh landfall, the smell of familiar European shores was an almost spiritual experience. The first hint that their suffering might soon be rewarded with recognition, rest, and possibly a very long nap. The challenges that remained were as practical as they were symbolic. Food, water, and supplies were still scarce, and navigation back into European waters demanded caution. Storms in the Atlantic could still scatter ships and sweep away even the strongest of survivors. Every port sighted required diplomacy, provisioning, and sometimes negotiation or bribery, just to secure safe harbor. For men who had battled the Pacific, South America, and the Philippines, these final hurdles were frustratingly mundane yet essential. Survival wasn't glamorous. It was a careful blend of luck, judgment, and the ability to tolerate more salt than a seagull could ingest in a lifetime. Despite the hardships, the return of the Victoria represented a monumental achievement. The crew's circumnavigation of the globe provided proof beyond doubt that the Earth was not flat, a fact that had been debated for centuries, and that the world's oceans were interconnected in ways previously only imagined in maps, legends, or sailors' tales. Their journey offered Europeans a first-hand account of distant lands, cultures, and resources, including the long-coveted spices that had sparked the entire voyage. The implications for trade, navigation, and global understanding were immense, effectively shrinking the known world and opening new pathways for commerce and exploration. Yet the human story behind this monumental voyage is just as compelling as the geographic achievement. Survivors recounted storms that seemed endless, months without fresh food, relentless heat, and the constant presence of death. They endured scurvy, dysentery, and the occasional rat attack that could have been described as organized chaos in miniature. Mutinies, skirmishes, and the loss of Magellan himself left deep psychological scars. Each sailor returned not just with goods, maps, and exotic tales, but with the knowledge that the oceans are indifferent, life is fragile, and the human spirit is absurdly resilient. The funny side of this historic misery was not lost on them either. Sailors often recounted the absurdity of their situation with a mix of grim humor and disbelief. The trip, originally estimated to last 2 years, had stretched into 3. Supplies rotted, morale wavered, and survival often felt like an unpaid internship in suffering. Yet humor, gallows humor, mostly was a lifeline, helping men endure the physical and mental tolls of their unprecedented expedition. The Victoria's arrival in Spain sparked awe, celebration, and a fair bit of disbelief. Only a handful of men had returned, each one carrying accounts that defied imagination. Months of endless sea, encounters with unknown peoples, battles, storms, and the death of their legendary captain. For historians, geographers, and the curious public, these narratives provided concrete evidence of global geography, while for the sailors themselves, it was simply a relief that they had not been permanently eaten by the ocean, rats, or boredom. The trip was supposed to last 2 years.
It took 3.
That's not a voyage. That's an unpaid internship in misery. The legacy of Magellan's expedition, completed under Elcano's command, extended far beyond the surviving crew. It proved that circumnavigation was possible, reshaped European understanding of the globe, and established the foundations of global trade networks. It demonstrated the limits of human endurance, the peril of ambition, and the surprising value of stubborn leadership, even if that leader didn't make it home. Above all, it showed that the world was bigger, stranger, and far wetter than anyone had previously imagined. By the time the Victoria docked in Seville, the remaining crew had endured more than most humans could comprehend. They were emaciated, weary, and probably still slightly salty from the Pacific, yet they returned as living proof that with enough audacity, discipline, and a slightly masochistic sense of humor, the impossible could be achieved. Their circumnavigation remains one of the greatest feats in maritime history, a journey defined not just by discovery, but by survival, wit, and the occasional sarcastic quip about leather-like meat, endless storms, and the occasional cloud hug. Long before the Industrial Revolution, long before James Watt was sipping tea and drawing diagrams, long before coal-streaked cities existed, humans were already playing with fire, water, and general ideas that made everyone else slightly nervous. Among these early tinkers, one name stands out: Hero of Alexandria, a mathematician and engineer in 1st century Egypt who may have been the world's first person to think, What if we let steam do the heavy lifting instead of people or animals? Hero, who lived in a bustling port city at the crossroads of culture and commerce, invented the aeolipile. Imagine a metal sphere mounted on a stand, with bent tubes sticking out like tentacles. Water was poured inside, heated from below, and the resulting steam would shoot out of the tubes, causing the sphere to spin. That's it. No practical application, just spinning metal, a combination of science, curiosity, and what might politely be called madness. The aeolipile wasn't powering factories, driving locomotives, or making breakfast. It was, in the words of modern observers, a very expensive toy that screams, "I might start the next industrial revolution if anyone notices me." The genius of Hero was not just in creating a device that could move with nothing but steam, it was in thinking about movement without muscles. Humans and animals had dominated physical labor for millennia. Oxen pulled plows, slaves hauled stone, sailors rowed endlessly. Hero's aeolipile challenged this fundamental assumption. Maybe motion didn't need someone to grunt or sweat. Maybe heat, water, and steam could do the work instead. And if that idea seems obvious now, consider this. Back then, most people still believed that the universe revolved around arbitrary mystical rules. A spinning metal ball shooting steam in all directions was, by contemporary standards, madness. The kind that makes neighbors hide their children and ask if you'd been possessed by the gods. Yet, Hero's invention had symbolic significance beyond its immediate utility. It was proof that humans could harness nature itself in ways that seemed impossible. Steam, a substance most people had only noticed when boiling water for tea or soup, was suddenly more than a nuisance in a kettle. It was energy, movement, and potential. Hero's aeolipile was essentially the ancestor of every steam engine, turbine, and locomotive that would follow, though back then it was viewed as a curiosity or a magical contraption rather than a harbinger of industrial might. There's also something undeniably funny about the aeolipile when viewed through a modern lens. Imagine a scholar in Alexandria walking past a clay table, seeing a metal ball spinning furiously with steam shooting out in every direction. What would they say? Yes, this is clearly how we'll build the next city. Or perhaps, I hope no one puts this near the cat. In either case, Hero's device was both awe-inspiring and completely impractical. Steam was being turned into motion, yes, but no one had figured out how to channel that motion into anything useful. In other words, Hero had invented a prototype for progress, while also inventing the concept of pointless but mesmerizing science experiments. It's worth noting that Hero's aeolipile also required patience, precision, and some surprisingly advanced metalworking. The sphere needed to be airtight enough to hold pressure, the tubes had to be bent just so, and the heat source had to be consistent enough to produce steam without melting the metal. This wasn't a toy you whipped up in an afternoon. It was a serious piece of engineering that did nothing practical. Hero, knowingly or unknowingly, was teaching a lesson that future engineers would need to relearn. Sometimes the first step toward revolutionary technology looks utterly useless. The aeolipile also represents the mindset that eventually drove humanity into the Industrial Revolution. It was curiosity unchained, experimentation without immediate application, and the audacity to say, yes, I can make water push metal around. Steam was unpredictable, invisible, and slightly dangerous, but Hero's work hinted that it could be controlled, measured, and eventually turned into something world-changing. In a way, it's poetic. The first steam engine wasn't a machine, it was a spinning sphere, mesmerizing enough to make people question their understanding of physics while chuckling nervously at what might happen if it exploded. Imagine someone watching a spinning metal ball and thinking, yep, this will definitely power our society. In the end, Hero of Alexandria didn't start an industrial empire or replace oxen with steam engines. What he did do was plant a seed in human imagination. That heat and water could move things without hands, hooves, or human endurance. That seed would lie dormant for over a millennium, waiting for the next wave of inventors, dreamers, and people willing to risk explosions, fire, and general chaos for the sake of progress. Hero may have looked like a man with a fancy toy, but he was really laying the foundation for a revolution that would change the world, just very, very slowly. By the late 17th century, Hero of Alexandria's spinning steam sphere had become a distant memory in dusty manuscripts, mostly admired for its novelty rather than any practical utility. Humanity had moved on, or at least some clever minds were trying to. Enter Thomas Savery, an English military engineer with a knack for invention, a healthy disregard for danger, and apparently zero fear of explosive chaos. In 1698, Savery patented what he called the miner's friend, a steam-powered pump designed to drain flooded mines. It was humanity's first attempt to harness steam in a genuinely practical, but still extremely risky way. Mining in England at the time was perilous enough without adding a potential bomb disguised as a pump. Coal, tin, and lead mines regularly filled with water, slowing production and endangering lives. Traditional solutions involved buckets, manual pumps, and sheer brute force, all of which were tedious, exhausting, and, let's be honest, kind of medieval. Savery's invention promised a simpler, more elegant solution: use steam to create a vacuum, suck water out of mines, and reduce the reliance on human or animal labor. Sounds brilliant on paper. In practice, well, it was a gamble. Savery's pump was deceptively simple. Water was boiled to create steam, which filled a sealed chamber. When the chamber cooled, a vacuum formed, pulling water up from the flooded mine below. Steam was then reintroduced to push the water into a higher reservoir. In principle, it was a clever use of basic physics, pressure, vacuum, and temperature differences. In reality, it was prone to explosions, leaks, and terrifying hissing noises that made miners reconsider the wisdom of ever inventing a machine. One moment, you had water rising magically. The next, you had hot steam spraying everywhere, accompanied by the occasional loud bang. It was like a mechanical game of roulette, where the stakes were bodily harm and property damage. The biggest problem with Savery's pump was pressure. Unlike later steam engines, which would contain and regulate steam, Savery's system was prone to cracking under force. Iron and brass of the time weren't quite up to the task of safely withstanding high-pressure steam, which meant every operation was a tiny explosion waiting to happen. Miners who thought they were getting a tool to save labor often got a complimentary lesson in thermodynamics the hard way, and if that wasn't enough, the system could only lift water about 30 feet at a time. Deeper mines required multiple stages, each increasing the risk of catastrophe. Efficiency, in other words, was more theoretical than actual. Even with its flaws, Savery's invention marked a huge step forward in engineering. It was the first machine designed to use steam as a source of mechanical power, rather than a novelty or toy. It was the prototype for all future engines, a demonstration that steam could be controlled with great difficulty to perform real work. Miners could now imagine their work being aided by a machine, rather than solely by wet, exhausted human arms. And yet, one could not overstate how terrifying it was. The miner's friend earned its nickname ironically. It might save a mine from flooding, or it might save it by instantly transforming it into a dramatic fireworks display. Humor was, unsurprisingly, part of the story. Contemporary reports describe miners and engineers nervously approaching the contraption, watching pipes hiss and gauge needles wobble. Some would jump back at minor explosions, spilling tea or tools in panic. One imagines a mine manager saying, "Well, it's either this or swim to work every day," while simultaneously wondering if life insurance would cover accidental steam exposure. Savery's invention was a lesson in early industrial risk management. Progress was possible, but it came with a healthy side of danger and unpredictability. Despite these challenges, Savery's steam pump gained attention. It was adopted in some English mines and inspired a generation of engineers. Even with its inefficiencies, the device proved that mechanical work could be performed by steam alone. The idea that water and heat could be harnessed to reduce human labor or replace it entirely was revolutionary. Savery may not have built the perfectly safe or efficient engine, but he proved the principle. Steam could do real work and people would pay to see it try. even if the result was terrifying. Savory's steam pump could save mines from flooding or blow them up spectacularly. It was a gamble. In short, Thomas Savory took Hero of Alexandria's playful curiosity and turned it into a proto-industrial machine, one that was both terrifying and promising. Miners could dream of drier shafts and lighter labor. Engineers could tinker with steam under the ominous threat of exploding pipes, and the world was one step closer to an age in which steam would dominate factories, railroads, and eventually every aspect of industrial society. It was messy, loud, and occasionally deadly, but like all good inventions, it was undeniably exciting. Savory didn't create a perfect steam engine. That honor would come decades later, but he did something arguably more important. He showed that steam wasn't just a curiosity, it was power, and that humans were just crazy enough to try to control it. In hindsight, it was a wild, slightly terrifying, but undeniably necessary step toward the modern world. By the early 18th century, inventors had realized something crucial. Steam had potential, but only if you could actually make it useful. Enter Thomas Newcomen, an English ironmonger and inventor who, in 1712, introduced the atmospheric steam engine, a machine that was less a toy and more a workhorse, albeit one with the subtle charm of a mechanical dragon, prone to overindulgence. Newcomen's invention was designed with a very practical goal: pumping water out of mines. Flooded coal and tin mines were the bane of British industry. Human labor and horse-driven pumps could only achieve so much, and previous attempts like Thomas Savory's steam pump were either too dangerous or limited in capability. Newcomen's engine, however, was a genuine leap forward. It could reliably lift water, operate continuously, and most importantly was slightly less likely to blow up the mine than its predecessors. The engine worked on a simple if enormous principle. A cylinder contained a piston. Steam filled the cylinder, and then cold water was injected to condense the steam. This created a vacuum, pulling the piston downward. The piston connected via a massive beam to a pump, lifted water from the flooded mine. In simpler terms, Newcomen had figured out a way to turn the invisible force of steam into predictable mechanical motion. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, it wasn't small, but it worked. And here's the fun part. It was huge. Imagine a machine so large that it practically had its own postal code. The Newcomen engine was often taller than a house, with massive beams, rods, and pistons stretching across the mine shaft. It required a dedicated team to operate and maintain, and it guzzled coal at a rate that could only be described as gluttonous. Coal consumption was enormous, fueling the piston like a teenager fueling themselves with pizza during finals week. The image of Newcomen's engine puffing away in the countryside, coal smoke curling into the sky, feels almost cartoonish, but it was very real. Despite its size and appetite, the engine was revolutionary because it worked consistently. Miners could now count on water being removed efficiently, and mine owners could finally extract coal, tin, and other resources without constant worry of sudden flooding. This reliability transformed British industry, allowing mines to operate deeper and longer than ever before. In a way, Newcomen's engine was the first industrial miracle that didn't require wizardry, just sheer mechanical ingenuity. However, the engine was far from perfect. It was slow. The piston moved at a pace measured in deliberate, almost somnolent strokes. Efficiency was low. Most of the steam's energy was lost in heating and cooling cycles, rather than doing actual work, and it consumed enormous amounts of coal, which meant that any economic gain from pumping water had to be balanced against the cost of fuel. In other words, it was like owning a giant mechanical pet that required feeding, cleaning, and occasional repair, but did exactly what you wanted it to do when it wasn't sulking. There were also practical considerations that made the engine more of a spectacle than a subtle tool. The machines were noisy, smoky, and intimidating, with great hissing and thumping sounds that made nearby villagers think a small earthquake had struck. Early operators had to understand rudimentary maintenance, such as lubricating massive beams, monitoring water injection, and keeping the coal fire at the right temperature. A lapse could result in minor damage, wasted coal, or a piston seizing up. Safety standards, of course, were non-existent. Accidents were part of daily life. It was an early lesson in industrial risk. Progress was loud, dirty, and occasionally terrifying. Yet the legacy of Newcomen's engine cannot be overstated. By proving that steam could reliably do work on a large scale, he laid the foundation for the next generation of engineers, inventors, and industrialists. Factories and mines could expand, energy could be harnessed predictably, and humans began to imagine a world powered not just by muscle, wind, or water, but by the controlled force of heat and vapor. It was big, it was slow, and it consumed coal like a teenager consumes pizza. In short, Thomas Newcomen transformed the abstract potential of steam into practical, tangible machinery. The Newcomen engine was a behemoth, clumsy, gluttonous, and ponderous, but it reliably performed work that humans and animals could only dream of. It was industrial progress wrapped in wood, iron, and smoke, and though it may have looked more like a lumbering mechanical dragon than a refined machine, it worked. And in the world of early engineering, that was more than enough. The Newcomen engine didn't make society efficient or elegant. It made it possible. Miners could extract resources from previously unreachable depths. Engineers could dream bigger. And the Industrial Revolution could finally start whispering promises of coal-fired cities, textile mills, and locomotives. It was an awkward, noisy, coal-guzzling miracle, and humanity loved it for exactly that reason. By the mid-18th century, the world had seen steam engines that were enormous, slow, and hungry for coal. Hero had spun a metal ball. Savory had gambled with exploding pumps, and Newcomen had built a coal-devouring giant that laboured faithfully but ponderously. Enter James Watt, a Scottish instrument maker with a sharp mind, a taste for efficiency, and the uncanny ability to see what others had missed. Watt didn't just tinker with steam, he reimagined it, turning it from a hulking curiosity into a practical, commercially viable engine that could power industry, factories, and eventually, entire nations. Watt's genius began with a seemingly simple insight. Newcomen's engine wasted a tremendous amount of energy by repeatedly heating and cooling the main cylinder. Imagine boiling water in a pot, dumping ice in it, and then trying to keep it hot again. It's inefficient and slightly maddening. Watt solved this problem in 1765 with the invention of the separate condenser, a secondary chamber that allowed the steam to condense without cooling the main cylinder. This meant the engine could work continuously, wasting far less fuel and delivering far more power. In short, Watt made steam efficient, a word that would quickly become a favorite among factory owners and investors, and a terrifying one for coal merchants. But Watt didn't stop there. He realized that pumping water from mines, while useful, was just the beginning. Factories and mills needed rotary motion engines that could turn wheels, drive gears, and power machinery. Watt added a rotative mechanism to convert the engine's vertical motion into a continuous rotary motion. Suddenly, steam wasn't just moving pistons up and down. It could spin shafts, power textile looms, and drive the gears of industry. The Industrial Revolution, long simmering, suddenly had a reliable and flexible engine to accelerate its spread. Of course, Watt's technical brilliance was only part of the story. To turn his ideas into a commercial reality, he partnered with Matthew Boulton, a savvy entrepreneur who understood the value of capital, marketing, and showmanship. Boulton and Watt formed a partnership in 1775, combining Watt's engineering genius with Boulton's business acumen. Together they began selling engines that were not only technically superior, but also attractive investments. Factory owners could finally purchase a steam engine that was reliable, efficient, and, miracle of miracles, profitable. The Watt-Boulton engine became a status symbol in industry. Factory owners bragged about their engines as if they were prized racehorses, occasionally shouting, "Behold, my factory is now powered by human ingenuity and controlled explosions." Investors, meanwhile, were thrilled but slightly nervous. After decades of unreliable, coal-hungry machines, a dependable steam engine seemed almost too good to be true. Watt made steam efficient, but also made investors very, very excited and slightly nervous. The financial world learned a valuable lesson. Technology that works can create wealth and mild panic almost instantly. Watt's improvements were transformative in other ways as well. By using less coal, his engines could operate in a wider variety of locations, not just near mines or rivers. Factories could now spring up in cities where labor was plentiful, transportation networks existed, and markets were nearby. The steam engine became a tool of urbanization, industrial expansion, and in subtle ways, social change. Workers who had once relied on water wheels or human effort were now employed in factories powered by mechanical motion, their lives intertwined with machines that never slept, never got bored, and sometimes leaked steam in terrifying bursts. It's also worth noting that Watt was meticulous and thoughtful, unlike some of his predecessors. While Savory's pump might explode in your face and Newcomen's engine might eat coal like a dragon with a mortgage, Watt's engines were designed with careful engineering, precision fitting, and attention to safety. He understood metallurgy, condensation, and thermodynamics, or at least what passed for thermodynamics in the 18th century, and applied it methodically. For the first time, steam power was predictable, manageable, and commercially viable. Watt's contributions marked the tipping point, where steam engines went from technological curiosity to cornerstone of modern industry. Textiles, ironworks, and mills could all be powered efficiently, transforming not only production, but also the pace of daily life. Towns and cities grew around factories, trade expanded, and the Industrial Revolution moved from experimental to unstoppable. Watt had taken the chaotic, explosive potential of steam and channeled it into a tool that would define the next century. In short, James Watt didn't just make a better engine, he made steam understandable, usable, and profitable. He turned a dangerous curiosity into a foundation for industrial society, transforming coal, heat, and water into motion, money, and a glimpse of the modern world. Without Watt, Newcomen's engines might have remained museum curiosities, and the Industrial Revolution would have sputtered like an underfed piston. Thanks to Watt, steam had finally grown up, but it still carried just enough danger, noise, and coal smoke to keep things exciting. By the late 18th century, James Watt's improvements had turned steam from a dangerous curiosity into a reliable, commercially viable engine. But the true magic happened when these engines left the lab and the mines behind and marched into the heart of industry. Textile mills, ironworks, and factories across Britain and beyond discovered that steam power could do what water wheels, human labor, and horse-driven machines never could: operate continuously, consistently, and with terrifying efficiency. The Industrial Revolution was officially in motion, and it was loud, hot, and smokier than anyone had anticipated. Textile mills were among the first to embrace the new technology. Spinning wheels and looms, previously powered by water or manual effort, could now run day and night. Factories were no longer tethered to rivers, streams, or waterfalls. Engineers and mill owners quickly realized that steam engines allowed production to expand dramatically, breaking free from the constraints of geography. Cities that had once relied on seasonal river flow now hummed with the rhythmic churning of machinery, powered by engines that demanded constant coal and attention. Productivity soared, profits climbed, and workers had a new soundtrack: the relentless thrum, hiss, and clank of industrialized motion. Ironworks, meanwhile, found in steam engines a near-perfect ally. Pumps, hammers, and rolling mills could now operate with unprecedented consistency. Previously, the pace of production had depended on human endurance or the caprice of water levels. Steam provided predictability. Engines didn't tire, complain, or strike. They were loud, demanding, and coal-hungry, but they worked. The result? Iron could be produced in larger quantities, faster, and more reliably, feeding the growing demand for machinery, bridges, ships, and later, locomotives. Yet the arrival of steam power in factories also transformed the lives of workers. Previously, labor had been physical, seasonal, and largely governed by daylight hours. Steam engines, running continuously, created a new rhythm of work: shifts, schedules, and near-constant noise. Workers traded horsepower for steam power, and they got coal dust, soot, and a truly relentless mechanical orchestra in return. Lunch breaks became precious moments of respite in environments where the air was thick with smoke and the floor perpetually slick with oil or water. Child labor, already a grim reality, became even more hazardous, as little hands were expected to navigate fast-moving machinery, powered by invisible forces they could neither control nor understand. Urbanization followed almost immediately. Factories could now exist anywhere, and people flocked to towns in search of work. Entire communities sprang up around industrial centers, complete with housing, shops, and roads designed to support the new economic hubs. Cities grew taller, denser, and smokier, as chimneys spewed soot into skies that had once been blue and clear. Steam engines, in a way, were not just machines, they were the beating hearts of burgeoning industrial cities, shaping urban life and forcing society to adapt at a pace that had few precedents. Of course, steam power brought challenges. Coal supply became a critical concern, and transport networks had to expand to meet demand. Factories were hot, loud, and often dangerous, with poorly ventilated spaces and moving parts that could sever fingers in an instant. Engineers and managers struggled to balance output with safety, efficiency with cost. In short, the Industrial Revolution was thrilling but terrifyingly intense, and the engines at its center were both saviors and tyrants. Humor naturally found its way into everyday factory life. Contemporary observers often remarked on the surreal experience of entering a mill or ironworks. Imagine walking past a massive beam-powered engine, hearing the hissing, clanging, and piston thumping, while coal dust coated every exposed surface. Workers moved like ants around an enormous mechanical beast, and visitors sometimes wondered if the noise would ever stop, or if it was intentionally trying to swallow them whole. Workers traded horsepower for steam power and got coal dust, soot, and a really loud environment. Despite the discomfort and danger, steam engines undeniably revolutionized production. Factories that once produced a handful of goods per day now churned out textiles, iron, and machinery at unprecedented rates. Inventors and engineers found themselves in high demand, laborers flocked to industrial centers, and economies began to shift from agrarian to industrial, almost overnight. Steam had moved beyond experimentation. It had become the backbone of society, powering progress in ways that were both awe-inspiring and slightly terrifying. By the end of the century, the influence of steam engines on industry was unmistakable. They enabled mass production, reshaped urban life, and redefined human labor. Coal-fired machines now determined schedules, workflows, and even social organization. Steam engines had invaded industry fully, not just as tools but as transformative forces that reshaped landscapes, societies, and economies alike. The Industrial Revolution was no longer a distant promise. It was a loud, smoky, unstoppable reality, and steam engines were at its heart. In summary, the advent of steam in factories marked the moment when human society began to rely on machines rather than muscle, on coal rather than daylight, and on engineering ingenuity rather than sheer endurance. It was messy, loud, and often hazardous, but it worked, it scaled, and it changed the world forever. By the early 19th century, steam engines had left factories and mines behind, and were poised to transform transportation. For centuries, humans had relied on horses, oxen, and the occasional boat powered by oars or sails. Progress was measured in miles per day, weather forecasts, and the patience of the animals in charge. Steam changed all that. Suddenly, movement was no longer limited by leg strength, wind direction, or animal fatigue. Steam engines promised speed, reliability, and a new kind of thrill, sometimes accompanied by mild nausea. The earliest experiments focused on steam-powered boats. Robert Fulton, an American engineer, successfully launched the Clermont in 1807, a paddle steamer that could travel upriver against the current without reliance on wind or manpower. Suddenly, rivers became highways, and journeys that once required days of rowing or waiting for a favorable breeze could be accomplished on a predictable schedule. Cities along waterways experienced a surge in trade. tourism, and, unsurprisingly, complaints about the noise and smoke trailing the steamboats. There was a unique charm to seeing a vessel that hissed, chugged and belched black smoke while carrying passengers upriver, occasionally startling unsuspecting ducks and dockside spectators alike. Steam didn't stop at water. On land, inventors began experimenting with railroads and locomotives. Early engines were slow, clunky, and prone to terrifying bursts of steam, but they proved a simple principle: mechanical motion could outpace muscle. One of the most famous breakthroughs came in 1829 with George Stephenson's rocket, a locomotive designed for the Rainhill trials, a competition to determine the best locomotive for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The rocket wasn't just fast for its time, it was a symbol that humans were about to travel faster than any horse, carriage, or foot soldier had ever dared. The rocket achieved speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, which may not sound impressive today, but in the 1830s it was exhilarating and slightly nauseating. Travelers unaccustomed to mechanical motion were often struck by the sensation of being propelled forward at a pace faster than their brains could comfortably process. Vomiting was occasionally part of the experience, especially for passengers sitting too close to the coal-fired furnace. And yet, despite occasional motion sickness, the advantages were undeniable. Journeys that once took days could now be completed in hours, trade expanded exponentially, and the movement of people and goods became faster, more predictable, and more exciting. Railroads also transformed landscape and society. Tracks carved through hills, bridges spanned rivers, and tunnels burrowed through mountains, creating networks that connected cities and regions in ways previously unimaginable. Entire towns sprouted along railway lines, economic hubs shifted, and people gained a new sense of mobility. Steam engines, whether chugging along rails or gliding upriver on paddle steamers, reshaped human geography, making distances shorter and the world feel smaller and slightly louder. There were challenges, of course. Early locomotives required enormous quantities of coal, constant maintenance, and skilled operators who understood the quirks of their machines. Boiler explosions were a genuine hazard, and the sight of a massive iron engine hissing and shaking as it steamed down the tracks could be terrifying for both passengers and bystanders. Bridges and tracks had to be reinforced, stations constructed, and timetables managed, a complex choreography entirely dependent on these temperamental machines. And yet, the promise of speed and efficiency outweighed the risks. Humor naturally accompanied this technological leap. Contemporary accounts describe astonished passengers gripping their seats, clinging to hat brims, and occasionally screaming as the rocket or other early locomotives thundered past. Horses, once the dominant mode of transportation, reportedly viewed these new machines with deep suspicion. Humans were finally traveling faster than a horse could run, and slightly more likely to throw up. It was thrilling, chaotic, and a little bit terrifying, a perfect metaphor for the Industrial Revolution itself. By the mid-19th century, steam-powered transportation had spread across continents. Ships, trains, and even early trams carried passengers and cargo with unprecedented speed, reliability, and scale. Commerce flourished, migration increased, and the pace of life accelerated. Steam engines no longer just moved machinery, they moved humans, ideas, and economies, ushering in a new era of mobility. In short, the marriage of steam and transportation transformed human experience. Journeys became faster, cities became interconnected, and the world suddenly seemed smaller and more accessible. Steam engines had crossed the threshold from industrial workhorses to vehicles of human ambition, proving that heat, water, and pressure could propel not just pistons, but society itself. They were noisy, smoky, and occasionally terrifying, but undeniably revolutionary. By the mid-19th century, steam engines were everywhere: factories, mines, railways, and ships. They powered the Industrial Revolution, reshaped cities, and promised progress at a pace previously unimaginable. But progress, as it often does, came with a shadow, and in the case of steam, that shadow was loud, hot, smoky, and occasionally deadly. One of the first and most obvious dangers of steam power was accidents. Early engines, though revolutionary, were far from perfect. Boiler explosions were frighteningly common. Engineers learned quickly that a neglected gauge, a crack in the cylinder, or excessive pressure could result in catastrophic bursts of steam, sending iron fragments, scalding water, and terrified operators flying in all directions. Industrial accidents extended beyond the engines themselves. Factories filled with moving belts, pistons, gears, and pulleys claimed countless fingers, hands, and occasionally entire limbs. In this environment, every day at work required vigilance, luck, and a willingness to accept that minor injuries were practically a badge of honor. Pollution compounded the danger. Steam engines ran on coal, and coal fires produced smoke, soot, and a thick layer of grime that settled on streets, clothing, and lungs alike. Cities that embraced industrialization suddenly became hotbeds of respiratory illness, coated in black dust from relentless chimneys. Rivers and canals, often used to power or transport industrial goods, became polluted with chemicals, waste, and coal residue. Living near a factory or railway offered convenience and employment, but also a constant reminder that progress was rarely clean. The social consequences of steam were profound. The machines required a workforce, and that workforce was often exploited. Long hours, dangerous working conditions, and child labor became defining features of industrial life. Children as young as 6 worked in textile mills, coal mines, and ironworks, tending to machines that could crush or scald them at any moment. Adults worked 12 to 16 hours per day, often in dimly lit, overheated, and hazardous conditions. Workers' health deteriorated, and accidents were normalized. The industrial city was a world where life was cheap, labor was long, and steam ruled. Urbanization intensified the human cost. Steam-powered factories drew millions into towns and cities, creating overcrowded housing, inadequate sanitation, and epidemics. Streets were narrow and dirty, the air thick with smoke, the water polluted, and diseases spread rapidly in crowded conditions. While steam engines facilitated economic growth, they also accelerated social inequalities, forcing workers to endure hardships in exchange for wages often barely sufficient to survive. Families lived near noisy, coal-choked streets, with chimneys constantly belching soot that coated every surface, including unsuspecting children playing outside. Even transportation had its risks. Steam-powered trains and boats were faster and more reliable than ever, but the speed came at a price. Boiler explosions, derailments, and collisions were frighteningly common, turning once innocuous travel into a potentially harrowing experience. Ships and locomotives, powered by the same forces that drove factories, could easily become deadly if engineers miscalculated pressure or failed to maintain their machines properly. Safety regulations were minimal, and the pursuit of efficiency, often the well-being of passengers or workers. Humor was still present, albeit grimly. Observers of the industrial age often marveled at the absurdity of progress that was both miraculous and terrifying. Workers, engineers, and bystanders developed a resigned sense of humor to cope with the dangers around them. One might imagine a factory foreman shouting over the hiss of escaping steam, "Congratulations, you survived another day without being scalded, crushed, or set on fire. Enjoy your coal-dusted breakfast." Steam engines, proving that progress is possible and terrifyingly combustible. Despite the dangers, society pressed forward. Steam engines were indispensable, and the benefits, mass production, rapid transportation, and unprecedented economic growth outweighed the costs in the eyes of governments, industrialists, and investors. Workers adapted to the hazards, families moved into crowded cities, and new laws and regulations slowly emerged to mitigate the worst excesses. Engineers improved designs, added safety valves, and developed better materials, gradually reducing but never fully eliminating the risks. In the end, the dark side of steam was inseparable from its brilliance. Industrialization was transformative but hazardous, thrilling but exhausting, productive but often dehumanizing. Steam engines demonstrated human ingenuity, but also the messy reality that every advance comes with trade-offs. Louder noise, dirtier air, longer hours, and a reminder that harnessing immense power is not without consequences. In short, steam was both hero and hazard. It lifted society from the limitations of muscle and water power, reshaping economies, cities and lives, while simultaneously demanding a steep price in accidents, pollution, and social hardship. The Industrial Revolution owed its momentum to these machines, but it also owed its darkest stories to the very same engines that promised progress. Humanity had discovered that with great power came not just opportunity, but smoke, soot, and occasional catastrophe. By the early 19th century, the steam engine had evolved from hero of Alexandria's spinning metal ball to the colossal industrial powerhouses of the Industrial Revolution. It was no longer a curiosity, a risky experiment, or a mind-clearing tool. Steam engines were redefining society, shaping economies, transforming cities, and ultimately reshaping human expectations of what machines and humans could achieve. The legacy of these machines is vast, deep, and sometimes chaotically loud. The steam engine's most immediate impact was on the Industrial Revolution itself. Factories, mills, and ironworks no longer depended on rivers, tides, or animal labor. Instead, they could operate anywhere, at any time, at an unprecedented pace. Production skyrocketed, costs dropped, and the very concept of mass production emerged. Textiles, iron, and later coal and steel could now be produced at scale, feeding both domestic markets and international trade. Steam engines enabled not just speed but volume, making goods more accessible to ordinary people and fueling consumer culture. People in towns far from rivers suddenly had access to clothing, tools, and other commodities that had once required localized, labor-intensive production. The engine also reshaped labor and urban life. Workers migrated to industrial centers, cities grew denser, and the rhythms of daily life changed. Workdays became regimented around machines that never tired, never rested, and certainly never cared about holidays. Urban landscapes were transformed by factories, railways, and canals. Entire neighborhoods grew around the hum and hiss of engines, with chimneys belching smoke that coated everything in sight. Children, adults, and sometimes entire families lived, worked, and endured the noise and soot, all in service of the mechanical heartbeat of progress. Steam engines didn't just power industry. They powered society itself, with all the chaos and messiness that entailed. Transportation, too, was revolutionized. Steam-powered trains and boats shrank distances, connected cities and accelerated trade. People and goods moved faster than ever before, linking regions, markets, and cultures in ways that had previously seemed impossible. The rocket, paddle steamers, and other locomotives proved that steam could conquer both land and water, turning hours into days, days into weeks, and weeks into possibilities. The steam engine made the world smaller, faster, and louder, reminding humans that progress often comes with a soundtrack of hissing, clanking, and occasional terror. Beyond industry and transportation, the steam engine laid the groundwork for modern energy generation. By converting heat into mechanical motion efficiently, it demonstrated principles that would eventually lead to electricity generation, turbines, and internal combustion engines. Steam's legacy can be traced directly into the 20th century and beyond. Power plants, trains, ships, and even some early automobiles relied on the same basic concept of harnessing energy to do work. James Watt's improvements, and the engines that followed, weren't just historical curiosities. They were prototypes for the modern age. The social and cultural influence of steam is also profound. It changed how humans think about efficiency, progress, and possibility. Factories, railways, and steamships became symbols of human ingenuity, ambition, and occasionally hubris. Societies learned to measure time, distance, and productivity differently, with schedules, timetables, and production quotas all centered around the predictable power of machines. Life accelerated, economies expanded, and the human imagination began to dream bigger, faster, and louder than ever before. Of course, the legacy isn't all polished. Steam also left behind coal dust, soot, industrial accidents, and crowded cities. The dark side of progress reminds us that with great power comes great mess, and often a lot of noise. But these challenges were inseparable from the advantages. Without steam, the Industrial Revolution would have been slower, less transformative, and far less chaotic. In embracing the power of heat, water, and pressure, humanity also embraced a new level of complexity, risk, and social transformation. Humor naturally sneaks in when reflecting on steam's journey. From the spinning metal balls of antiquity to coal-fired factories and racing locomotives, the evolution of steam has been equal parts miraculous and absurd. Engineers, workers, and observers alike marveled at the machine's power, while shaking their heads at their size, noise, and relentless appetite for fuel. From spinning metal balls to powering cities, steam engines turned the impossible into everyday chaos in a very loud way. It's a fitting summary. Steam made progress achievable, productive, and unforgettable, all at decibels that would make modern city planners weep. Ultimately, the steam engine's legacy is enduring. It demonstrated that energy could be harnessed predictably and applied creatively. It reshaped industries and societies, and it transformed human expectations about work, speed, and technological potential. It laid the foundation for the machines, engines, and power systems that continue to shape modern life. And it taught a critical lesson. Progress is possible, even if it comes with soot, noise, and occasional explosions. Steam engines weren't just machines. They were symbols of human ambition. They reminded us that we could turn fire and water into motion, heat into power, and ideas into tangible transformation. They made the impossible every day, and they did it with a loud, persistent, coal-fueled roar. The Industrial Revolution may have been messy, noisy, and hazardous, but it was powered by steam, and that makes all the difference.